Yes. Yes, that was at the top of their list.
I
Freedom.
didn't mean any of the others.
That's right. That's right. Well, let me paste in our little linkages here. And I guess I should drop in the link as well to the Early Christian Writings website, which we are using today. Oops, assuming that I can use my computer competently. There we go. Let's get this show on the road. Uh, it's 7 minutes past the hour. Dog wisdom time, cynic time, time to get this not a show on the road. For our weekly reminder, behold Plato's man. If you could but stand a little to the side, all you would-be Alexanders, we want nothing more from any of you. This Homo Aquarius has his own garden to tend to, and so do you. Thanks to global warming, it's already Mason bee season here at Huckleberry Haven in Seattle. And Bee Papa, yours truly, has been shamefully remiss. I'm so ashamed. I haven't been cleaning my bee cocoons yet. I haven't replaced my bee reeds. And already, because of the sunshine, the first few little black bees are buzzing about, confused in my back garden. When will Bee Papa get up off his butt and make things right for his little pollinators? Don't worry, little bees. Papa's coming. But not just yet, because just now we're here on the Zoom call, as we are every week for our dog wisdom time, a few minutes after each appointed hour to tend to our nature within.
For
Speaking
the
of April, yes, yes,
sake of science, how much earlier? So this is March. So it's normally a bit later in March they come out.
yes. It'd normally be 2 weeks from now they'd be waking up, but we had a run of warm days. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Kenneth Smith Seminar, where Diogenes reminds us that the proper conduct of life requires right reason or a leash. Our philosophical namaste, the crazy in me salutes the crazy in you. Let us leash our crazy to improve our conduct and make Diogenes proud. It's time once again, not for something new to think about, but something new to think with. Hello, philosophy. I'm your moderator, Rick Marshall, with the 181st weekly installment of our long running seminar about Smith's existentialist philosophy book, Millennia in Microcosm, in which he explores how to escape the trap of our certainty through the act of thinking, much of which consists of little more than rearranging our prejudices according to our ideologies and desires. We each build the labyrinth that traps us by the law of unintended consequences, which haunts all mortal minds. To escape our labyrinth's wildly distorting flatland effect, we must learn to think in new dimensions and arise from our flat Procrustean beds on Icarus wings, but let us not fly too close to the sun. In his book, Smith guides us through the ancient and medieval worldviews to see through their eyes. They saw truths we can't, and, vice versa. In the seminar, we explored the ancients for 2 years. Now we're a year and a half into the medievals, where a new kingdom of spirit will struggle against the genocidal religious empire erected in its name. By book end, Smith will guide us through modernity to see it through ancient and medieval eyes as the weird, parochial, mixed blessing, two-edged sword of a perspective it actually is. When we can shift among these three worldviews, we will have created for ourselves a little true freedom to question what we assume and to pursue new worldviews. When last we left our intrepid heroes, we were in paragraph 3 of chapter. No, we were in paragraph 4 last week of chapter 9. Haha, we're going to go paragraph 5 today. This puts us in the middle of a 3-year arc about medieval civilization and its worldview. We augment Smith's text with primary source materials to hear directly from medieval and proto-medieval thinkers, such as Paul. Paul. We begin with the early Christian sayings tradition. We began with the early Christian sayings tradition, with the Gospel of Thomas and Q's sayings, and then the early pre-Pauline Christ cult fragments that Paul preserved in his letters. But now, starting last week and continuing today, we are beginning our 4th segment in medieval civilization, and it's about Paul. This seminar is organized by the reserved and thoughtful David Roel, who writes each week's capsule summaries. This week, he wrote, dun, 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 founding religion on fideism encourages dogmatic irrationalism, replacing philosophical inquiry with emotionally driven certainty rooted in fear, wishful thinking, and unexamined subjectivity. Such a mentality abandons the true philosophical task. carefully discerning reality and distinguishing authentic faith from self-serving rationalization, thereby fostering intellectual stagnation and deliberate suppression of challenging truths. Thank you, David. I post that into the chat for our for anyone who wants to refer back to it, but it's also on the Meetup invite page. You can find it there. David reads ahead to what Kenneth Smith is saying and anticipates what we might be talking about in the religious part of our talk, and then he puts together these nice little capsule paragraphs. So thank you again, David. We see you even though you're hiding your video. We hear you even though you're on mute. We know you're there, and we appreciate everything you do to make these seminars possible. This seminar is no show, no debate, no logic puzzle, no attempt to transmit dogmatic philosophical systems. We are an existentialist philosophical book club. Hello, book club members. Smith is a full-time philosopher, used to be a philosophy professor. He writes in a dense, allusive style that refers to other writers and artists to bring them into the conversation and to bring our conversation into their multi-thousand-year-long conversation. Together, the book club members explore all those tangents and allusions and his main text, and we add our perspectives into the mix for a rich, patient conversation, not to win, but to philosophize together. With that out of the way, let's begin today by diving back into the early Jesus movement with Paul. Just a reminder, there are many strands to the early Jesus movements, something that Stephen has pointed out in the past. Luke even directly alludes to it. There were many things written down. Hardly any of them are preserved, and hardly any of the corresponding Jesus movements are documented. We have fragments and we have indirect evidence. So what we're doing here is attempting to reconstruct a little bit of a very complex history, knowing that we're not going to get all or even most of it. We're just going to get a little taste. And that taste is going to help us to understand the origins of the medieval worldview. We're going to take as close a look as we can at each of the fragments that we've got. We're proceeding one step at a time. We're using the evidence that's left to us. Each one that we have evidence for is going to get its attention. We're going to talk about would-be prophets, apocalyptics, exorcists, proclaimers, miracle workers, passion narrators, secret meaning puzzlers, Gnostics, sayings collectors, and community builders. We've covered 3 so far. We did the Thomas sayings, we did the Q sayings, and we know that there were many other sayings documents around, but they're gone now. We don't have any evidence for them. We only know that they were there because some of the early writers tell us they were there. And we then spent a few weeks looking at 7 pre-Pauline Christ cult fragments that Paul preserves in his authentic letters. And what a important piece of work Paul did for us by being so careful to preserve what he was taught and write it down verbatim for us so we can get a glimpse into the years before he began working. Talk a little bit about that today, but mostly today we're going to talk about Thessalonians in the first half, and then we'll talk about Kenneth Smith's chapter 9, paragraph 5 in the second half of the talk. And as with last week, I'm starting just looking back briefly to show us where we left off. So we had, first of all, Romans 3:24 through 26 and 4:25, which is a little poem that preserves a stage of the Jesus movement before they had any interest in Jesus's death. They barely allude to it. They just say, "Yep, he died," but there's nothing special about it. There's no resurrection. There's no blah, blah, blah. The only thing special about it is, according to this fragment in Romans, Jesus lived a faithful life. He was faithful to the Torah law. And he was so faithful that God said, that's amazing. Well, anybody who follows in your name, even if they don't obey Torah law, I will allow them into the blessed community. Jews and Gentiles can sit down together and nobody's sinning. They're allowed in because Jesus lived this exemplary life and died as a testament to his faithfulness. This is a very early stage. I mean, there's no tomb, there's no disciples, there's no resurrection, there's no Jesus appearing on earth to his disciples. None of that stuff is here. There's no heaven and hell. The only thing that's here is this interest that we talked about in the sayings movements, that the early Galilean Jesus movement largely started as symposia of dislocated people from across the Greco-Roman world who were looking for some kind of new way of life. And they admired what the Jews had. and they wanted to learn about Judaism and be part of the Jewish community, but they weren't allowed in because they didn't follow Torah law. And these early Jesus movements began thinking of reasons why Jews and Gentiles should be allowed to sit down together and live together and practice together. And Romans clearly illustrates that stage of development. We're going to talk briefly today about when that was, because Paul gives us a little bit of a timeline to understand what was happening right before he began his ministry. Next up, 1 Corinthians, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was handed over, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, also the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And here we have documented this idea that what these symposia were doing was gathering to share meals together. And as with every other kind of symposium that was happening, all these other intellectual supper clubs that were happening all over the Greco-Roman world, this one opens and ends with a reminder of whose name we're gathering in. There were supper clubs just like this for Heracles, right? For Isis, you name it. This one was for Jesus, who was the wonderful teacher, who they see as being the Lord of the newly emerging kingdom of God, by which the people gathering in his name, studying his sayings, and Jews and Gentiles gathering together, they're going to create a new world just by treating each other within these gatherings as though the new world already exists. By treating each other with the kindness that they wish the Roman Empire displayed, they're going to begin replacing the Roman Empire one dinner at a time, one gathering at a time, and start ushering in a new kingdom of God. And they see their Lord as being Jesus, the one who taught them to do this, that they could get out of the trap of the Roman Empire just by beginning to live as though it were already gone, at least in these brief moments. Then we have Paul's core kerygma, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. And in the later version, they add to Cephas, then to the 12. But in the original version, it's obviously a 6-line parallel structure of 2 stanzas, each of which is made of 3 lines, the second of which line in each stanza is according to the scriptures. And this again represents a very early stage of Christianity. It's after 1 Corinthians 11, 23, 25. It's after Romans 3, 24, 26, and 4, 25. This is a stage in which, and Paul says he didn't invent this. Paul says he's just quoting what he was taught, that the core of the teaching is that Jesus, who's now called Christ for the first time in these, that he died, he was buried, he was raised, and he appeared. 4 verbs: died, buried, raised, appeared. And this is the justification for the blessed community that they're trying to create. Again, no heaven or hell anywhere to be found here. No details. There isn't even a cross named. It doesn't even say he was crucified. I mean, read it again. It's there are things that we associate with the Jesus story that are just not here yet. They're going to appear later at later stages in the development of Christianity, but in the early Jesus movement, this is the core of the kerygma that Paul's excited about. Then he quotes Galatians. In Galatians, in 3:28, he quotes this statement that is really core to the Galilean cosmopolitan "let's all be brethren together" movement. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There's no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. This is this idea of creating the new kingdom of God as a brotherhood of man, in which the old tribal divisions fall away and don't matter anymore. The only thing that matters is let us treat each other with kindness and as equals. And we can begin creating that new world. I'll call on Stephen in just a moment, but I'm going to drop the rest of these fragments, and then I'll go directly to Stephen. Next up from Philippians 2:6 through 11 is the Christ hymn. Although he was in the form of God, he did not think equality with God was anything worth grasping, but emptied himself and took the form of a slave, born in the likeness of humankind. And when he appeared on earth as a man, he humbled himself and was obedient to the point of death. This is a chiasm. It's a double structure. There's 2 parallel stanzas, and the first one is about humbling, as we see in all these statements. And the second one is about exalting. Therefore, God exalted him on high and gave him the name above every other name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. And this is the first time we have Jesus and Christ and Lord all in the same statement. What becomes the later typical three-part invocation of Jesus, the earlier statements predated that. The pieces were coming together one at a time. And this Christ hymn is radically different, not only from the early Jesus sayings that we saw in Thomas and in Q, but even in these earlier fragments like Romans and 1 Corinthians. What we're seeing here, or Galatians, what we're seeing here is not that Jesus was a man. We're seeing that Jesus was a God. Jesus was a God, and he decided to lower himself, to prostrate and humble himself, and be obedient and faithful like a slave. And in return, God exalted him and set him above all the other gods, set him at God's own right hand. So this is a radical change in theology from what we saw in the earlier statements. Jesus is now not just the Lord of the kingdom of God that's being created on earth by people who are acting as though it already exists, and he's not just lifted up after a human being who's lifted up after he dies. He's now a God who descended and then rose again. It's an incredible transformation. And you think about how much time does it take for a theology to develop like this? You're talking about some rapid transformations in the belief system of the early Christians. Here are the last two fragments. They're short, and then we'll get to questions, comments, and concerns. First, Galatians 1, 3 through 5. Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to set us free from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. The kind of thing that you would say at these gatherings, right? In remembering Jesus and remembering why you've come together, why you're breaking bread together, why you're drinking wine together, why you have fellowship together. It's, this is the context. And then finally, the shift from ethos or character to spirit. Paul puts it in 2 Corinthians 3:17. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. All seven of these fragments, Paul preserves them, but he says he didn't create them, he didn't invent them. These aren't his innovations. These are the things he was taught when he first encountered the Jesus movement and embraced it. Today, we're going to talk about how and when he encountered that Jesus movement and what the timeline looks like for Paul. And we're going to use that as a lead into 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I have a name for the view I like about early Christianity, the apocalyptic Christianity, which from John the Baptist and probably even before John the Baptist. And we see some references in the gospel that people were expecting a type of judgment day and the resurrection of the dead. And this was the core of how it started. Now, you're proposing this sort of, new tradition of everybody just sitting down to have peace. Now, in my apocalyptic vision, I'm saying Jesus is arguing for a change of behaviour on the basis that the world is going to change. If you want to build up a whole load of wealth in your lifetime, that's cool, but you're wasting your time now. That trip is all over, dude. Or, if you've had that long-standing desire to, that long-standing feud with the farmer across the valley to stick a rock in his head, wasting your time, dude. That's the past. Everything's going to be new. So I have a name for mine, the apocalyptic vision. So this sort of peacenik vision you have, Rick, do you have a name for it?
So the thing about what I'm trying to say, and evidently have not said adequately, is that there were dozens of different versions of early Christianity. And the apocalyptic version is one of the versions. And I haven't talked about it before today because we're just sort of following the sequence of Bert and Mac's book. But First Thessalonians introduces apocalypticism. You're gonna be happy. We're gonna this is gonna he's gonna we're gonna first start talking about the apocalypse level. And this in no way means literally that First Thessalonians is the first place where we see apocalyptic Christianity. It only says, as we work our way through this dozen some odd different variants of Christianity, each of them's got a different take, and the apocalyptic take is every bit as legit as the rest. We're going to talk about it.
Yeah, well, my claim, of course, is this precedes all the other attitudes within Christianity. Uh, well, I propose it was a revolutionary movement, and George Gonzalez cracked up in the meeting when I was bringing up that the only vision he has of Christianity is a conservative movement, a conservative movement that supports at all times the authorities. And I'm saying, well, in the apocalyptic movement, Jesus and John the Baptist were probably opposed to the official authorities of the religious Judea. So I regard it as a revolutionary movement in the beginning.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
you've got this idea that they're sort of got this peacenik movement going from.
I do not.
You don't.
There's about a dozen different threads. We can only trace them one at a time, but we're not saying that the first one I talk about is the first thread. We're not saying that. So I don't know which is first, and I don't think we have the evidence for which is first. And that's why it's important that we cover them all. It could be the apocalyptic one was first. Certainly, we see apocalyptic layers begin to appear even in the Q sayings, not in the first round of them, but by the third round. And that doesn't mean apocalypticism came after peaceful, dinner clubs. There could have been a simultaneous apocalyptic movement happening at the exact same time. We don't have the evidence. We don't know. Your theory is as legit as any other.
Of course, each of these theories will need a name.
Yeah, somebody can name them. I'm just going to name them by source.
Thank you.
So the part of the apocalypse, I know that there's more than one apocalyptic movement because we see it appear in the Q sayings. We know the Q sayings are independent of Paul. We don't see the Q sayings appear again until Matthew and Luke. So all these people are drawing off of different threads. And so when we see apocalypticism appear in Paul, we have to think he didn't get it from the Q group. He got it from somewhere else. And we don't know where that somewhere else is. It could go all the way back to Jesus. And this is the thing about the scientific method, of course, is that we have to be willing to not take a stand and say, here's the evidence we have. From this evidence, any legitimate model will do. And it'd be nice if we collect multiple models and take them off the shelf based on which ones fit whichever evidence we're looking at. But I think we need all of them because the one thing that we can see about the early Jesus movement is the evidence proves there is an extreme diversity of perspectives. We don't know why, but we know that there is. It doesn't start as a single homogenous movement with one point of view. I mean, Jesus presumably had one point of view, but we don't have anything directly from Jesus. We only have all the things that the people after him said he said. And when they start talking about what he said, a lot of them disagree with each other. So, this is where we're at. There is an apocalyptic strand, and today we're going to start talking about it. And we won't ever stop talking about it from here on out. You'll be satisfied, Stephen, because now that it's here, it's going to keep coming up over and over and over in our discussions. Certainly, even the most peacenik hippie version, if you want to call it that, of the early Jesus movement Q community, nevertheless, they're saying we hate the established order. We intend to replace the established order, and we're going to do that by gathering together and behaving in direct opposition to the established order. And they're saying it was Jesus who taught them to do that. So the argument that Jesus had some revolutionary qualities and apocalyptic qualities, there's evidence for that in the very oldest things that we can find. So I'm with you. I don't think we're on different sides on this. I think we're on the same side. Um, and the full picture gets painted in more as we keep adding threads. So it's coming today. It's coming today. John, come off mute.
Oh, I
Welcome.
just want to say, Rick, I love it when two of my favorite philosophy hosts are in the same room, John being a Rick, John. Just
Hi,
want to make
Ginny,
that
John.
I'm
clear.
not as good as Rick is. I'm an amateur. I'm an amateur philosophy host.
I am
Rick's an expert.
too. I am another
Yeah, Rick
amateur.
is not amateur, right, John? But you guys are terrific.
Welcome to the call,
Thank you,
John.
Ginny.
What's on your mind?
Uh, so I was wondering, with the apocalyptic view, would people want to kind of eschew that at this point in time? Like, if you were to hold that view, it's kind of, in my view, been illegitimized. Um, that's one of my questions. But then the other question is, what's the theology we're talking about here? Is this like a clean separation between God the Father, so to speak, and Jesus Christ the Son? Like they're different entities? And my understanding is that would be different than like the current view of, modern Christianity as developed in the Catholic Church, which is like God the Father and Jesus the Son are kind of like the same entity, like three parts of the same entity. Whereas here, it's kind of seems like there's a distinction, like there's God the Father, and he can run around and do stuff, and Jesus can run around and do his own thing. Kind of like this is kind of like more like the Mormon view.
Great questions, John. Let me tackle them one at a time. Part of what we're going to be doing is a little catch up for you, and that's fine. We are good with catch up. This is the 181st session. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that we've talked about before, but it changes as we learn more. So it's always Kenneth Smith always wants to cycle us back around to touch base with where we were because it takes on new layers of meaning. So let's do that right now. Let's start with the apocalypticism. What we see in the Q sayings is that we're working off of a book Burton Mack wrote. It's called Who Wrote the New Testament. He's written a number of other books about early Christianity, but Who Wrote the New Testament in particular is a book that he wrote specifically not to advocate any perspective of his own. The entire purpose of Who Wrote the New Testament is to document the big gulf between what's, I can't call it a consensus, but let's say the predominant views of the majority of biblical scholars on the one hand, versus what the rest of us think, what we were taught in Bible school, what we were taught in church, what we pick up from hearing other Christians or televangelists or you name it. Burton Mack is pointing out what a lot of biblical scholars are aware of, which is that in the last 150 years there has been an enormous amount of scholarship done on the Bible, and enormous breakthroughs have been made about what the Gospels are, what the epistles are, how they relate to each other, how all of this relates to history. What does it say about early Christianity, medieval Christianity, late Christianity, all these things. Huge breakthroughs, and almost none of it has percolated into pop culture. There's a giant abyss separating the way that most biblical scholars, regardless of whether they're theist or atheist, Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. If they're biblical scholars, they have a bunch of things that they know and share in common that the rest of us mostly don't know. So Burton Mack's purpose in this book, Who Wrote the New Testament, is only to share kind of what is the standard typical understanding of biblical scholars about early Christianity and the origins of the New Testament. So our focus isn't on modern theology. And at this point, we're not even into the thick of medieval theology. We're doing very early theology, the first 100 years. And what we're finding is that the theology in the first 100 years, first of all, it changes rapidly. Just in these 7 fragments that I've shared, all of which Paul documents as being what he encountered when he first, met Christians and began learning from them. We see in these 7 fragments a rapid series of transformations in the concept of who Jesus even is and what is his relationship to the Jewish God and what is this congregation's relationship to Jewish law. It's changing fragment by fragment, and it's not changing a little, it's changing dramatically. So first of all, there is that transformation that's happening. Second of all, the evidence that Burton Mack says most biblical scholars accept is that there are many different early Christianities, and some of them have never even heard of each other. Their theologies are so different from each other, they basically seem like different religions. If it weren't for the fact that they all point to the same founder, you would think, how can these possibly be compatible? And for us, where that's difficult is that we've been given a Bible school version of early Christian history that asserts that Christianity started as a united movement with a single theology. and that over time, various heresies split off, various deviations split from that. But it was the job of the Orthodox to try to, correct those heresies and to keep the unbroken line of succession from Jesus through his disciples and the apostles to the bishops of today intact. That's the official argument. But the evidence doesn't support that at all. The evidence shows no uniformity in the beginning. It's like it's a whole bunch of different Jesus movements. And that instead, over time, they begin to get knit together into this mosaic or composite or quilt that becomes what we think of as Christianity today. So a lot of our basic assumptions about the nature of Christianity, or like the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, in the first century, none of that exists. There's no evidence for it. For example, in this Romans fragment that I shared from Burton Mack, in the first Romans fragment, he's not only is he not a God beforehand, he's not a God afterward either. He's just a righteous man. That's wild. That is not, God the Son in the way that we conceive of it from Christianity. This is a completely different view of Jesus and who he was. And we saw that in the sayings as well, in the Q sayings and in the Thomas sayings. All of the older layers of them say nothing about his death, his resurrection, that he was divine, that he was the son of God the Father. It's all missing. It's not there. Even as we're going to see today, even in Paul, where at first glance, it looks like he's talking about the things we know, the cross, which he will mention, but although he hasn't yet in the stuff we've talked about. Even that stuff, we're not reading it. We're not actually reading what Paul wrote. We're doing a Rorschach test. And the reason we do a Rorschach test with Paul is because when they canonized the New Testament, they put the Gospels, which were written later, ahead of the epistles, which were written earlier. And as a result, hardly anybody ever reads the epistles for the first time fresh as their first exposure to what Paul thinks. We only get to Paul after we've had 4 Gospels and Acts drill into our heads this later conception of Christianity. And as a result, we read that later conception of Christianity into the letters, even though Paul never said those things. It's what we're trying to do here is disentangle Paul from all the later theology of the Gospels, the canons, that the things that the Pope said, the things that the Reformation said. We're trying to strip all of that away and say, what did Paul actually say in his own words? What is his theology? And what we're going to find is it's from our perspective, it's weird. It's so different from what we're expecting.
That's
So
interesting. So like,
go ahead.
so yeah, when I hear the word Lord, when they say the Lord, I'm thinking the Lord in the God sense,
Exactly.
the God Lord. I'm not thinking like the Master Lord.
Right.
So maybe that's like the distinction I have to draw out.
That's the Rorschach effect, right? We all read
Yeah.
it that because that's what we were taught by the later things. But that takes us to your first question. What is this apocalypticism? And this we find evidence for even before Paul, even before the pre-Pauline fragments, as Stephen was sort of alluding to earlier. There's elements of apocalypticism as early as we can find, any references to early Christianity. And one of the forms of apocalypticism, not the one that we're going to talk about later today, but one of the forms of apocalypticism, which is discussed in the Q sayings and the Thomas sayings, is the idea that Jesus taught that we're living in an unlovable empire. No one could possibly love the Roman Empire. And they established law and order by punching you in the face. That's their thing. Yes, you can keep your gods and blah 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 blah, but pay your taxes or we punch you in the face. This is the Roman Empire. They're not their propaganda is very crude. You see this sword? You feel like obeying now? No? Okay, then I stab you with it. I mean, what Mark Antony did to Cicero because he didn't like Cicero's writing, he sent an assassin to stab him. Kenneth Smith calls the Roman Empire the Mafia Empire. And Burton Mack calls it the unlovable empire. And the thing is, it's not even just the Roman Empire, even the Alexandrian Empire before it. It just smashed all these old temple states. These temple states that have been around for thousands of years, that people's value systems and their religions and their tribes and their relationships and their feeling of how you fit into the political economy, those things have been stable for ages. And Alexander just smashed it all. And he basically replaced it with a new form of the polis, of the city state. And it wasn't the authentic Greek form. It was a corrupted form in which the only people who got the vote were the Greek invaders, and everybody else were subjects instead of citizens. So it was already broken before the Romans came along and just picked up and continued what Alexander had done. So the result is, and he talks about this a lot in the early chapters of this book, Burton Mack does. He says the thing that we have to understand is we're talking about an era of chaos when everybody's feet have been swept out from under them. They have all these values, they have all these religious beliefs, but they have no way to make sense of them because in the past, those values and beliefs were plugged into a political economy, a temple state political economy that made everything make sense, right? What you paid for and why you paid for it, who was in charge and why they were in charge, how to live a virtuous life. The answer to all these hard questions were coherent in each of these places, whether you're talking Mesopotamia or Persia or Egypt or what have you. But after Alexander smashes it all, and then after the Romans take over, it's all people have been scattered to the winds. Their temple state political economies are gone. They have these yearnings for culture and for belonging that aren't being satisfied and will never be satisfied by the Roman Empire. Everybody feels like something has to give, something has to change. It is, in the words of Robert McKee, who wrote the book Story about how to tell stories, this is a protagonist era. This is an era in which you have an enormous number of willful people who are ripe for change. They need things to change, but they don't know what to change it to. Nobody has an answer. Everybody's gone through a blender and they're staggering out the other side going, now what? And along comes this movement in Galilee that says, since we've been blenderized, we can't go back to the old tribal silos. It's not going to work anymore. And even if we could, the Romans won't let us put the old tribal political economies back in place. There's no going backwards. The Jews have had their kingdom ripped away from them. The Greeks have had their polis system corrupted out from under them. That nobody has the things that they need. And so let's make something new. Right? This is kind of what the early sayings suggest is core to Jesus's teachings. This has to go. The emperor has to go. The empire has to go. This way of life, it's not a way of life. It's a way of death, and it has to go. And let us form symposia, and we will gather together in cosmopolitan groups, Jews and Greeks and Persians and Babylonians and Egyptians and you name it. Let's just get together, have dinner, treat each other like human beings, and figure out what is this new world we're going to create to replace this old rotten world. And Jesus's phrase for the new kingdom to replace the old kingdoms, he calls it the kingdom of God. He says, the kingdom of men is corrupt. Behold Caesar. He's corrupt. He's rotten. So we need to do away with these kingdoms of men. We need a incorruptible ruler above us. And so we choose God because God is, all good, all knowing, all powerful, blah, blah, blah. The only incorruptible thing. That will be the basis for the new kingdom to replace what's in the world today. So there is this apocalypticism that's built in right from the beginning in the very earliest fragments we can find. It says this has to go. But what form that apocalypticism takes has nothing to do with what it is today. It's a totally different kind of animal. It's a revolutionary spirit. It's a revolutionary spirit. That's the kingdom of God. And after he dies, the fragments that we can find that talk about Jesus are basically asserting we don't want Caesar for our Lord. We want this wise guy, Jesus, for our Lord, because he pointed us in the right direction. And so he's going to be our Lord. And that's the way they meant it at first. Maybe.
Interesting. Thank you.
So for us, this isn't about trying to say how it actually is. We don't know how it actually is. We're using Burton Mack's book to help us look at the fragments of evidence we have and say, maybe this is a model that makes sense out of these fragments. We're not sure. And if it's true, if Burton Mack's hypothesis is true, his hypothesis is Jesus didn't get specific about exactly how the kingdom of God should work. He didn't get specific into how are you supposed to organize your communities and come together and be cosmopolitan and create a brotherhood of man. He just said you should do these things. If that was true, if that's what happened, that would explain why 3 years after Jesus died, there's a dozen or more different Jesus movement groups, and they're all different from each other because each group is deciding for itself what does it mean to create a new replacement kingdom. How should we treat each other? Each group's deciding for themselves. That would explain the diversity. It doesn't mean that it happened that way, but it's just a model. So that's kind of the background that we're operating on.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, John. Great question. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just a couple of things. I'll be very brief. I think that it is a revolutionary type of movement because it goes from this idea of seeking, power to service. So, you're no longer looking to dominate, you're looking to the idea of God itself. So that movement is one that where you can say, do unto others as I have done to you. You can't say that if it's, the reverse, if you're seeking power. So it gets a little harder. So this is an invitation to participate in a global community. And so that's essentially how this is the idea of, this universal brotherhood, if you will. And this is this idea that, God is coming down, so he's tangible now. And this is the behavior that you ought to be engaged in, not the behavior of trying to conquer. And I mean, the washing of the feet and things along those lines. If you look at those types of stories, that's what the message generally is saying. Even the whole act of coming down, even if the Gospels were to change. But the one thing that you said that was very, very interesting to me is I was wondering if you could maybe go a little deeper in this movement between character and spirit. That's an important one to me. They both aren't really tangible, but they have very, very different meanings, and so that change, so to speak, there's an element of divinity that's involved, right? And so you have divinity and divine revelation and seeing the God in everyone else, all those things. So I think that's a very big shift. That it kind of needs to be thought through, because I think that a lot of times you hear people, even today, they identify as, well, maybe not as religious, but as spiritual. And so kind of understanding what that really means. And you can relate that back to character to a certain degree. So maybe that movement a little bit, just go just a little bit deeper. I know that that's not completely on point, but if you could, thanks.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure.
Appreciate that.
So, ethos is character or nature. This is the Greek term. The background for those just joining us for the first time is we think of Galilee as part of Israel. That's the way, when we look backwards, we imagine Galilee as just a neighborhood in Israel. But there was no Israel at this point. In the history that we're talking about, there was a stack of kingdoms along the coast, and in the south was Idumea, and that's where the dynasty that had ruled Judea had come from, and north of that was Judea, which is the closest thing to Israel. In terms of our conception of Israel, that's about as close as you could get. And then north of that was Samaria, and the Samaritans and the Judeans already didn't like each other. They had a lot of beefs. The Sumerians were pretty ticked off at the Judeans for coming back and claiming to be the real Israelites, when the Sumerians, who had stayed put mostly, other than some who'd been abducted, they mostly stayed put. They said, no, we're the real Israelites. So Samaria and Judea don't agree about even what should be in the holy book or who gets to count as a Jew. North of Samaria is Galilee. And Galilee is a cosmopolitan crossroads. It is not a backwater neighborhood of Israel. It is to its west along the coast is Philistia, the Phoenician city states, Tyre and so forth. The great trading, ancient trading ports are on the coast to the west of Galilee. To the east of Galilee is an area called the Decapolis. It's a place where Alexander and his disciples set up 10 polises, 10 Greek Hellenistic city-states, and they live in a totally Greek manner. Even though it is the Middle East and, Israel or Jordan or however we want to imagine it, it's essentially an extension of Greece. They have amphitheaters, they have Greek temples, they speak Greek, they follow Greek laws. It's basically Greek. And that's so on one side you've got Phoenicians, on the other side you've got Greeks. To the south you've got Sumerians and then Judeans and then Idumeans. And to the north you've got Syria. And Syria is very important to the history of Paul and to the history of early Christianity and so on. It's where many documents that survive today from the ancient world were copied in Syria, and Paul got his start there. So Galilee is not a Jewish place. There are Jews, but they're essentially part of the diaspora. Their synagogues are mostly not buildings; they're mostly just gatherings in a tent, and there are no big cities in Galilee. This is not closely associated with the temple complex to the south. It's basically a cosmopolitan crossroads. That's where Jesus got his start. These are the people who began the Jesus movement. We've always talked about it as though they are Jews, and if we're sophisticated, we say they were Jews who were Hellenized. They had exposure to Greek. But in fact, it may be the opposite. Burton Mack says it's at least as likely that what we're talking about is Gentiles. Gentiles who are frustrated with the Greco-Roman civilization, such as it is, and are looking for something else. And so they are forming clubs to brainstorm. What are we going to replace all this crap with? And they're looking at the Jews going, these people have their act together. We want to learn more about this stuff. And we want to incorporate a lot of that into our vision for a new, better world, a new brotherhood of man, a new kingdom of God. All right. So with that as the background, we have to understand the relevance of these Greek terms like ethos. Ethos means character or nature. Anytime Kenneth Smith refers to ethos, he's always quoting Heraclitus, ethos anthropoi daimon, right? Which we usually translate as character is fate. And your ethos is your inner nature. Heraclitus says we're basically amphibians who are little mortal finite beings who exist sandwiched between two infinities. The infinite nature around us, which has its own rules and laws and principles. And if we don't learn what those rules and laws and principles are, it'll stomp on us like the mice in the grass at the feet of the elephant. And likewise, a second infinity that's inside us, a second nature, the inner nature. Our ethos is our inner nature, and it's every bit as lawful as the nature around us. It's just harder to see, which is frustrating as hell, because how we make choices, what makes sense to us, how we think about the world is all leashed to this invisible nature inside of us, which is following its own laws in complete disregard of what we care about or consciously think is important. We say today I have all these great plans, and then noon comes around and we're still sitting on the couch going, what happened to my beautiful plans? And what happened is your inner nature had a different idea from your conscious mind, and it usually wins. Your conscious mind only gets its way when your inner nature says, okay, fine, we'll do that thing. But if your inner nature is against it, your conscious mind is sort of helpless. And this is the basis of all modern psychology, the role of the unconscious in us. The Greeks saw the unconscious as not just this roiling mass of steam engine, forces that need to be cathartically released. They saw it as exactly the same as the nature around us, in that it had principles that were fountains of order generating drives and impulses in us according to our lawfulness. So when the Greeks taught history, when they taught biography, when they taught mythology, when they taught grammar, even how to write, they always taught from the perspective of ethos. If you want to be, and the Romans picked this up too. If you want to be a great Latin writer in the time of Paul, the way that you learn to write Latin is by imitating great Latin writers like Cicero. You copy their works, right, by hand so that you've had it pass through your fingers, and and then you learn to style yourself to write in the same kind of way, to argue in the same kind of way that Cicero does. And then eventually you only graduate after you take the final step. And the final step is, and we know this is true because we found, little writing exercises and plates in junkyards all over the Roman Empire. I mean, every place there was a writing school, there were these piles and piles and piles of documents from the students' exercises. The exercises always, and also people wrote about how to teach this stuff. And we have those documents where they say. So what it culminates in is the idea that you need to not just mimic Cicero, but you need to understand his character so well that you can portray him like an actor portrays a role. You can become Cicero, just like any of us could pretend to be Dr. McCoy or Spock or Captain Kirk in a new situation. Dump Spock onto a bus, and somebody says something completely crazy, and half of us are, it's right on the tip of our tongues is that would be illogical. We're ready, we're prepared to be the character of Spock, and this is what they're teaching in the Greco-Roman world. You have to become Cicero. Imitate Cicero. And your graduation lesson is your teacher assigns you a situation Cicero never encountered, but you have to have learned and mastered and practiced the character of Cicero so much that you can become Cicero in that situation and write the essay that Cicero would have written. And that is when the teacher says, I have nothing more to teach you. You are now a master of writing. Character, ethos. This is the core of the educational system. And this is why so many schools and cults and philosophical systems are not copying around biographies of their founders. They don't care when these people were born or died or events in their life. That's of no interest to them. All they care about is they want the sayings. What are the pithiest, most characterful sayings of Diogenes? I mean, you go search for Diogenes today, you're going to find all these fragments of things that he did and said. And mostly that's it. If it weren't for one or two writers in antiquity, we'd know nothing about his life. But boy, everybody knows about Plato's, behold Plato's man, as he throws a plucked chicken on the floor at Plato's feet. This is Diogenes. This is the character of the man. And so says Burton Mack, we should not be surprised that in this Greco-Roman Hellenized world, when we find the very earliest Christians in Galilee, and what they're carrying around are the sayings of Jesus. They don't seem to know or care how he died, or where he was born, or if his mom was named Mary. That stuff is of no interest to them. What they really are interested in is, what is the character of this guy, and how can we bring that character to life ourselves in our lives, so that in effect he never died. Wherever there's a Jesus follower and the Jesus follower gets the character of Jesus and can live according to that character, Jesus lives again in that person. And this is not a theological position. This is the Hellenistic position. For 500 years, this has been the dominant culture. This is how they see your relationship to your teachers. You are inhabited by them. You are what's that word? Entheos, right? You are possessed by them. The God within is in, and theos is God. Our enthusiasms are the entheos by which our character is possessed by the daimon of Jesus, or the daimon of Cicero, or what have you. So in this, we see that for the Greeks, character and spirit are actually related to each other. Right?
Yeah, I really like how you put that too. I mean, and explained it as well, because I was actually even having a conversation about some of this recently about, if you get into some of the more metaphysical conversations with anybody, they could be a ardent Christian or whatever it may be. They're not as concerned about that. they're more concerned about imitating the behavior.
Yes.
There's two things: the community and imitating the behavior. And then, well, what does that then entail, right? So there's this idea of a spirit, that the spirit, what it is to have the spirit of something, but it also means managing your character.
Yes.
So I mean, even if it's just a question at that point is to how is reality revealed, right? I mean, so is it there a divine revelation, or is there just something that's discovered? But at the same time, you're managing your personal integrity, and what that does allow us to do is to function with each other.
Yes.
And so there's a functional benefit to these things, and that's where the idea of even how we organize our societies, right? That everything kind of is based off the fact of some degree of integrity
Yes.
in the institutions themselves, right? So anyway, that's it. It's yeah. I really like how you made the connection and how they weren't necessarily separate.
Right.
It's not, kind of something where you draw this hard line. That's more of a modern
Like
distinction, I would say.
the dualism of the
Uh,
modern perspective. Yeah. Body
it very
versus
much so.
soul. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, and so that's a really important distinction, something that I feel is kind of lost in today's conversation.
Yeah.
Not today. I mean, you know what I mean. Today
Generally.
in the world.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so anyway, well, thank you for that.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's
Thanks.
part of what's so interesting about this stuff is that, we can read these Greek or, we can read Paul and we think that we understand him because we see the word and we translate the word into the English equivalent and we assume nothing's been lost. But of course, English isn't Greek and it certainly isn't classical ancient Greek. Modern English isn't ancient classical Greek. So it can be hard for us to grasp. For example, what else would Paul have taken for granted? As a there is a tension for a Hellenized Jew like Paul, because what the soul is in Judaism is a little different from what the soul is in Hellenism.
Yes.
In among the Greeks, your body is the real you. Your body's not some spacesuit that the real you is animating and carrying around like the modern conception in which your soul is you. In the ancient conception, your soul is just the song that your body sings while you're alive, when you're healthy enough to be alive. And when you're dead, when your body gets too sick, it can't sing that song anymore. And the breath goes out of you, your soul goes out of you. And because the soul goes out of you, you're now a corpse instead of a person. But you didn't go away somewhere with the soul. You were lying there on the ground decaying. That's the real you among the Greeks. The body is the real you. And for us, that's mind blowing. It's so impossible. Well, we were just like, well, of course the soul is you. And the Greeks were like, no, the body is you. It's like
That's
if
right.
it's the song isn't the real me, right? I'm me. The song is something I'm singing.
And that's a very deep point. I mean, and that gets even into what is me, right? The even the ability to observe what is me, right?
Yeah.
And then that ability, the distinction is different, but yet the same.
Yes. Yes.
And that's that gets back to the question that I believe that I think John had was the idea of father and son, kind of, that
Exactly.
this they're distinguished but they're the same,
Exactly.
so that and then you have that life breath, if you will, the spirit. So anyway, even though that's it's interesting, and I know that Ari's waiting, so and I know that he has some
I know
very
he's going to
it's a
drop something
big.
fabulous on us, isn't he?
Yeah, and he's got a lot to figure on this. I know that, and I think some of those distinction between, um, you know, Jewish concepts and even the Hellenistic and Christian concepts of spirit and breath, like life breath, is really interesting to explore.
Yeah.
But it's I also know that he's pretty busy too. He's got a lot going on. He's got a special moment coming up. So yeah. So I'm gonna pass it on then.
Sounds good. Let's see what Ari drops on us. Come off mute, Ari, and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, first is Joe's being very kind. My wife is theoretically due to give birth today, but we'll see if and when this happens. So we're all very excited here, and maybe I'll get to share a new member of the group next week or something. But
Congratulations.
yeah, but I will say a couple of quick things. There's something I wanted to speak about a while ago. It was very brief, but it was a really cool parallel again. I guess call it parallel. I don't want to make any more judgment claims, just more like a juxtaposition. You were saying this whole thing about the Lord, and is that just this guy who's like the master of the house, or is that the Lord, like, the Lord? Hold on. Sorry, hold on.
Oh, you're breaking up a little.
Can you hear me? Yes. No?
Little fragments.
Did I lose you guys?
We hear you now.
Can you hear me? Okay, I'm trying to get somewhere where I can get a better signal. Let's see what I can do. Okay. How are we doing now? Any better?
Yeah.
Yes, no, maybe so. Okay. Sounds good. Okay. So it's a couple of quick ideas. It's something I think you have to be Jewish. It's almost, wouldn't call it a secret, but I don't think anyone would know this. That when you pray your own prayers, there's words for God. And one of those words is you don't say what it really says. That's the four-letter, what they call the tetragrammaton, the four-letter thing. We put in another sound there. Basically, you say the word Adonai, which means Lord, but it's not meant to be the name there. The name is supposed to be something closer to like Yahweh or something. That's what it's probably is like. I was taught, I don't know what's really going on here, but I was taught that the claim is that Jewish people lost this memory. We don't know what the name really sounds like anymore, so we don't pronounce it anymore because we don't want to get it wrong. And so you just say this other thing instead, which just says master or Lord or whatever. And yeah, so that's that. I thought that was really interesting because that sounds a lot like what's going on with Christianity. And then the last thing was about, I think, the Jewish idea about the soul and the body and the self. I was actually learning to some degree from the Eastern perspective that seems similar to like the Eastern perspective that the ego is not the self. What you feel is not the self. All these things are not, these are things that the self experiences maybe, but they're not the self. So Judaism says the same way, you're not your soul and you're not your body. You are the combination of those two things. They have to be together for you to be you. They exist, though fine, but if they're separated, you're not you anymore, right? And so if you were to, let's say, be, resuscitated again or whatever it's called, I'm forgetting the word that Jesus did, right? He comes back to life. You would need your body again. So it's, at least in this case, Jesus seems to follow the Jewish rule, which is he's got his mind and his body back together again. So he's actually going to be him, right? But if you were to put him in another body, not him anymore, right? So this is the Jewish, I don't know what you would call that, but that's the take on that situation. I thought that would answer some clarity in that.
Nice.
That's probably it. That's good. Yeah.
That is a dialectical relationship between body and soul, right? You need them both.
So where's the spirit in all of this?
So I think the spirit, so there's also in Judaism, there's different, spirit is maybe more of a category and a soul is a subtype because plants have a spirit of some sort. Animals have something called a nephesh, which includes blood of some sort. And then humans have something extra going on beyond that. But these are all like types of the same thing. And this is more to say like a plant is also like a form of life that needs to be thought of as like sacred. So you're like not supposed to mess with that either. It's not just like rocks. Rocks you can break up. Nobody cares about rocks. But plants, if you break them up, you can't put them back together. It's just that kind of idea. So there's something sacred, and I guess you refer to that invisible sacredness to some form of a spirit. But I think it's a general category. And again, English isn't really a good translation. So.
No, it's terrible in English. Our words, we don't even know what they mean. So, You know, how can we be sure which one is the right one to translate these other languages into? So
Yeah.
Kenneth Smith likes to say that spirit is soul in motion. You know, the soul is the makeup of your inner nature. But the spirit is kind of the breath of movement, the longing, the growing, the becoming, the acting
Oh, this is
of the
nice. This
soul.
works. Yeah, Jewishly, this works too because this one sounds like a noun form and the other sounds like a verb form. So it's just
Yes.
fine. Yeah.
Yeah, you might think of it that way. And so, for example, when he's distinguishing the classical conception of a divinity from the medieval conception, he says one of the big differences is that in the ancient world, you know, the all souls are bound, like you were talking about. They're the soul of something. You know, the soul of the soul of the plant, the soul of the acorn, the soul of the cheetah. But with the medieval god, we get what he calls actus purus, pure activity, pure spirit, that is not constrained by itself. It doesn't have internal limitation. The medieval Christian God has no limitations. He could at any moment do anything. You know, whereas I have limitations. You have each of us is our character binds us in so that our soul can only take certain actions. The medieval God has an unbounded spirit, a pure, perfect spirit from a medieval monastic perspective. And so this really emphasizes the dynamism of the soul as being what spirit is. It's the it's capacity to act and its capacity to transform. But of course, all this stuff is in flux during the time we're talking about. You know, this is and you know, we're talking about around 50 CE, and at that point, everything is up in the air. And
Yeah.
Christian theology really hasn't been created yet. You know, you've got a lot of people thinking real hard about what is this? What does it mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess before I go off, I wanted to say one last thing, which is a bit of a tease, which is so I'm reading more of this book called The Great Partnership between science and religion. By that's the way language Rabbi Sachs calls it, but it's a pretty authoritative. Like I realize the Jewish perspective, whether it's right or not, on what he claims is the from a linguistic and civilizational point of view, what happened between the ancient Hebrews, ancient Israelites, and ancient Greeks. He talks about it based in language that, something even as much as that Hebrew goes from right to left and Greek is left to right. And Judaism is all about narratives and perspectives. And so the words are much more verb forms, while in Greek there's abstraction and universality. So there's a lot more nouns going on. And he just breaks off into this world of how this leads more to like Greece being the prototypes and proto science, and then the Jews being like more like proto monotheists. And that he, but it's just there's this nice argument, and he is very based in this like how Jesus probably spoke Aramaic and Hebrew and didn't probably speak Greek. But only later, when Paul and the early Christians get it, becomes Greek, and so therefore it transforms from a Hebrew culture to a Greek culture. Whether this is true or not, it's a really interesting thing. So I thought I'd send you some of this stuff, and I could either present some of it like just as a summary, or you could dig into it how you want. But anyways, it's really interesting stuff. And I would like, if nothing more, for the group to kind of evaluate it in an open-minded, no judgment sort of thing. Like, what do you think? Does this sound good? Does this sound interesting? Does this just sound like doesn't have enough evidence, or it's tons of evidence? I don't know. So
Yeah, we could set aside a week to cover that.
we don't have to do a week. I'll send you something small ahead of time so we can be planned and whatever. Anyways, this is apparently I was talking to other people in circles. Some people really like this book also. So
yeah.
just might be interesting and fun. So yeah, we're a
Well,
book
could you
club,
put
right?
it in
So
the chat?
I,
Could
I
you put
dropped
it in the
I think
chat?
Rick just did. Yeah,
I
Rick
just
just did.
did. I put a
Yeah.
link to Goodreads where you can read some reviews of it, summaries.
Because I
Yeah.
find this all very confusing.
Yeah.
It is. It
It is
really is.
confusing. It is intrinsically confusing. You know, and part of what's happening here is that, you know, the Greeks had their conception of the body and the soul and the spirit and how all these things work together. And the Jews had their conception of the body and the soul and the spirit and how all these things work together. And then the Christians mashed them together and made something that is very complicated and hard to untangle. And I was just writing an article this morning about how the English language is like that. right? English is a train wreck between Anglo-Saxon, Norman French, Latin, Greek, and every other language we've ever chased down a dark alley to go through its pockets for spare vocabulary, right? And the result is it's extraordinarily it's not hard to pick up some basics in English, but it's extraordinarily hard to master. And you wonder whether anyone ever really does. I was reading an article about the difference between narc and narc. Most people don't even know those are two different words. Narc as in a narcotics officer and narc as someone who tattles on somebody else turn out to be two completely different words with different spellings and different etymologies. They're not the same word. They're not derived from the same thing. They're not related to each other, but everybody thinks they are. And even people who think that they've mastered English think that these are the same word, but they're not. One narc with a K, which is to tattle or cause mischief, comes from Roma culture. The gypsies. I mean, whereas narcotics, and so it's over 100 years old. It goes way back. Whereas narc as a narcotics officer is a recent idea, like the 60s or something. So anyway, when you get these train wrecks between multiple systems that have collided, and then generations of people have been doing surgery after the fact to try to knit it all back together, and it was never together to begin with. So now they're creating some sort of weird Frankensteinian organism. The results are all very confusing. English, Christian theology is very confusing. I mean, people get theology degrees trying to disentangle all this stuff, and the English language is very confusing. So trying to translate either ancient Jewish or ancient Greek ideas into modern English when we've all been soaking in this Christian theology, it's the child of two confusions, a linguistic confusion and a theological confusion. You are right to be confused. It's as I was saying in the thing that I posted this morning, what people who are trying to master English do is they collect crazy, stupid, bizarre combinations of words like narc and narc. It's like in our head, we have a little word hoard. Editors and stylists, there's no other solution. We just have to collect these stupid, crazy confusions and like put them in the little case in our mind and look at them from time to time and go, narc and narc, man, what the hell is with this language? For those who don't know, effect the verb, effect the noun, affect the verb, and affect the noun, right? Two spellings, either with an E or an A, and for each one, there's both a verb form and a noun form. It's 4 different words: affect, 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 affect. And almost everybody gets it confused. And if you Google randomly, they will often tell you there's only 2 words. They'll say affect is a verb and effect is a noun. It's like, no, baby. I mean, I understand it would be great if it were that simple, but no, there's 4 words. There's a noun form and a verb form for each one, and they all mean something different. God damn this language. Who the hell designed this thing? Oh, that's right. It's a
Yeah,
train.
and neuroscience made it worse because affect is like the way you describe feeling.
Exactly. That's affect the noun. It's like this is confusing. Don't get me started on complementary and complementary. Stephen, come off mute.
yeah.
Tell us what's on your mind.
Wait, could I say one quick? I wanted to put in the chat. I found a 7-minute video that's from the Rabbi Sachs's website, which is like his animated short TLDR of that book.
Fantastic.
So it's just, I'm going to put that in there. It's a video. It's on YouTube. You want it? Great.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Stephen. What's on your mind?
I like that. Thank you.
Well, the age of the dictator is at hand. Like it said in the intro to Spartacus, I assume, Rick, you remember that intro and that little line, the age of the dictator is at hand. This argument about body, soul, and spirit, there was a very strong, I have mentioned before, there's a powerful moments in the Dark Ages around the 9th century, where the Eastern and Western Church went their separate ways on the issue. Now, the issue was not whether there is spirit or soul or body. That's all there as far as all these different groups are concerned. But the question is, do you have an individual spirit? For example, the claim an animal doesn't have an individual soul as one of their perspectives. An animal has a group soul. That means its qualities of soul are the product of something objective. An animal still feels soul, but it doesn't have personal control over it. But man, they claim, has a personal individual soul. You know, the Western Church would say that a man has an intellectual soul. He can think. He has a personal ability to have thoughts, to manipulate thought, if you like, as the personal ability. Now, the Eastern Church continued with the idea that man had a spirit, whereas the Western Church dropped the spirit from the trichotomachy of man. And this has results like, for example, in the Eastern Church, you can go off and be a monk and meditate on the spirit. And the Eastern Church will say, maybe you can establish your telephone to God individually without the church. Whereas the Western Church was saying you don't have an individual spirit. The telephone exchange is strictly through the Vatican. Your path to the spirit, you do not come to the Father other than by me in the Vatican. Now, this argument that humans don't have an individual spirit is interesting. Now, the Western Church didn't totally rule out the spirit. It claimed that the human soul had certain spiritual qualities, but denied it having an objective spirit. Now, an idea of spirit is Jung and his archetypes. For us, you get the picture that when we talk about the archetypes, we're talking about the spirit in the sense of the Western Church as generalized abstractions that we're subject to. We don't determine things. The spirit has been determined for us by other forces, but the spirit is present. We're not without the spirit, just as an animal is not without soul qualities. It's not that animals don't have a soul. They don't have an individual soul. This is where the argument is. And I hope you sort of appreciate the point I'm trying to make there, Rick. That this is the crutch of the argument. We're in a sea of spirit. The spirit is the atmosphere. It surrounds us. We breathe it in. We breathe it out. But we don't make the air. We're subject to the air. So this is the argument about spirit. Is there a quality within us that creates a certain degree of spirit, or is it purely like the atmosphere, an objective process for us? And it's purely this objective atmosphere of archetypes, as Jung would say, that we can't really individually determine spirit. We can only relate to the archetypes of spirit. So this is my poor way of trying to express this concept of the individual nature and how we might be subject to things which are beyond us. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. And yeah, what Ari just said goes along with what you said. You know, all the Hebrew words for soul or spirit or life force are all words for wind or breath or breathing, and it's the same in Greek too. Psyche is perhaps linguistically related to the words for breath or air. It's these are complex things. So I'm gonna, with that as the intro, I'm gonna take us into Paul today. We did some Paul last week. I'm gonna redo some. Yeah, hi Sharon. I see you smiling. Yeah, we did some Paul last week, and you know, those who want to see last week's thing, it's on YouTube under David Royal's YouTube account. We'll retouch a little of that today, but from a new angle. The thing I want to work on today a little bit is the lead into Thessalonians, and to do that, I want to talk time frame. So First Thessalonians is widely regarded by biblical scholars as the oldest authentic book of the Bible. We don't mean that there weren't any other the oldest authentic book of the New Testament. And we don't mean that there weren't any older legitimate books that were used by Christians. We mean none of the older books were included in the canon of the New Testament in the 400s when they canonized. Thessalonians, especially Paul's 7 core letters, the ones that scholars agree were actually written by him. As Burton Mack says, these are some of the most important early historical Christian documents we have, because they're the first documents that we have that basically name the author, and that we're pretty sure the author actually wrote. I mean, there's a bunch of letters that claim to be by Paul or Timothy or John or whoever that we're pretty sure were not written by Paul or John or Timothy or James or whoever. They were written by other people pseudonymously claiming to be, as is the case with the 4 Gospels. John didn't write John, Mark didn't write Mark, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Luke didn't write Luke or Acts. There were communities. We use the names as a stand-in for a community. There were a community. If there are multiple threads of early Christianity, each of those threads of Christianity was working on at some point they began working on writing down what they had come to understand as Christianity from their community's point of view. And the different communities had different points of view. And so they're documenting these things. And they would write these things in the name of a founder, in the same way that someone learning Latin would write their graduation thesis in the name of Cicero, because they're trying to live the character of Cicero in writing about this thing that Cicero never encountered. It's not that they're trying to fake, they're trying to legitimately bring to life the character of Cicero. And it's the same with the folks who wrote Mark. They think of Mark, who's long gone by this point, as their founder, and they are trying to understand his perspective, and they write as closely as they can from what they believe his perspective would have been. And then later people say, well, look, it's Mark's gospel. And the classical perspective would be, yeah, it's the gospel of the character of Mark, but not necessarily Mark himself. In fact, people say probably not. Paul's the first guy where we're like, not only is these written in the character of Paul, but these 7 letters are actually written by Paul. As far as we can tell, Paul actually picked up his pen and wrote these damn things. That's him. He's not just claiming, it's not some later writer claiming to be writing in the spirit of Paul. Now, Second Thessalonians it's widely agreed. Second Thessalonians is not Paul. It's somebody trying to write in the character of Paul. And they make several mistakes that allow us to tell that it wasn't Paul. And one of the mistakes is their theology is more advanced. They're writing from a theology that's decades later. They're taking for granted ideas about the nature of Jesus and Christ and God that Paul would have said, "What are you talking about? I never heard these ideas in my life." They're later developments, and they don't know that. They don't understand the difference between themselves and Paul. So this is a place where in trying to bring to life the character of Paul, they have failed, because they've actually injected some of their own perspective into it that disagrees with Paul on some pretty fundamental things. The other way we know that it wasn't written by Paul is it takes the perspective of some of the antagonism towards Jews that happened later among Christians. There isn't really much, if any, antagonism towards Jews in Paul's time. Paul's a Jew. He says so. Hello, I'm a Jew. The fact that I'm a Christian doesn't change the fact that I'm a Jew. I still observe Torah law. He sees himself as a Jew. The whole idea of Christians being the ones who look at askance at those Jews and go, those Christ killers, why did they do those things? None of that's Paul. So anytime you see that stuff in Paul's letters, it's either an authentic letter of Paul that someone has injected a few lines into, which happens. We'll talk about that today, or it is the whole letter is not Paul. It's just written by somebody later on claiming to be Paul. Again, using this whole They're trying to channel the ethos, the character of Paul as best they can. But being a different person, they actually have a different worldview, and they're not entirely aware. One of the ways that we know is that languages change over time, and Greek changes from Paul's time until the 80s, 90s, 100s, 110s, 120s. Modern scholars can see the differences. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Blessed are the groovy, for they will get down with their funky selves, is the kind of mistaken idiom that people used to make when they were doing these sorts of channeling. And they don't get that Jesus would not have said groovy or funky or get down with themselves. None of that. Even JFK wouldn't have said those things. And JFK is only separated from us by decades. That's the kind of time frame we're talking about. Scholars are getting to the point where they can say, there was no funky, there was no groovy, that's later. So if it claims to be a letter by Paul and it's got the funky and the groovy in it, then we know, no, that's people trying to channel Paul. So Thessalonians is the first one that we're reasonably sure about. First Thessalonians is the first one we're reasonably sure is actually Paul. And it's let's say give or take a year, it dates to about 50. It dates to about 50, right in the middle of the first century. It's fantastic. And there are a number of things that we know from Paul's writings that we can build more timeline around this. So the second piece of timeline we're going to stick in here is 48. And all of these are derived from the 50. If we assume the 50, the rest of these follow. If the 50 is off by a year, then the others are off by a year. This is our frame of reference. But 48, Paul travels to Jerusalem to meet with a Jesus movement group known as, quote, the Jerusalem Pillars, right? Which includes Peter, James, and where's my list here? It's got Peter, James, and John. Okay, so that date, basically 2 years before he really starts his mission, he travels to Jerusalem and he meets with this group, and he says the group is called the Jerusalem Pillars. As far as we know, this hasn't been tampered with, so they probably were called the Jerusalem Pillars. So this would be one of the 24 or 36 or God knows how many different threads, different Jesus movements, and this particular one is set up in Jerusalem, and they call themselves the Jerusalem Pillars, and they include these 3 guys. Now, the thing we have to know about Peter, James, and John is that we don't know anything about them. Right? Anything that we know from the Gospels or Acts or anything else, those aren't Paul's Peter, James, and John. Those aren't the actual human beings he met. Those are the mythological Peter, James, and John. They're important to know about. We're going to study them later when we get to the Gospels. But they're important to know about in the same way that the mythological Paul of Acts is important to know about, even though the mythological Paul of Acts cannot possibly actually represent the real Paul. So there are many places where Acts directly disagrees with the things that Paul says about himself in his letters. And as far as we know, Paul was honest. His letters are fairly clear, and they don't make extravagant claims about what he's doing and what he's up to. So in general, when Paul's letters disagree with Acts, we're inclined to say the mythological Paul of Acts is a mythological figure, not the real figure. So for us, it's going to be very hard to separate the mythological Peter, James, and John from the real Peter, James, and John, who the real Paul met in 48. So our brain wants to play Rorschach test. It wants to project. It's like the kid who wants to put his hand up in class. Ooh, I know this one. Call on me. The first Avengers movie had a hilarious scene where the Avengers are gathered and someone makes a reference, and Captain America says, "Ooh, I got that one. I knew what that one meant." He's so excited because he's been out of circulation for so long. He's so excited. He actually gets this reference. And our brains are like that. We're like, ooh, you mean the James who did this, or the John who did that, or the Peter? No, we don't mean any of those things. Those are the mythological Peter, James, and John. So we don't know very much about the real Peter, James, and John. We do know that they were in a group called the Jerusalem Pillars. We know they were one of many threads. They were not the original canonical thread. There was no, as far as we can tell, there was no one canonical original apostolic succession thread. This is one of several dozen threads. And these guys are in Jerusalem. And And Paul meets with them because he has this grand vision for Christianity that he's really excited about. And he's about to begin his mission, but he thinks maybe I should check with somebody. And who can I check with who might, help me figure out if I'm about to do something terrible or not? And he says, I'll go talk to these Jerusalem Pillars dudes. And as Burton Mack says in his book, biblical scholars agree pretty widespread that the meeting did not go well. It was not a successful meeting. What comes across is this whole epiphany that Paul has had, this idea that, what if this Gentile Jesus movement is right? What if they don't have to follow Torah law? Flying monkeys. Yes, thank you. The flying monkeys reference. That's Geneva got it in one. I'd forgotten which reference it was. So Paul has this idea. He's been pursuing early Jesus gatherings, these Gentile early Jesus gatherings in Galilee, and he's been telling them they're doing it wrong. He's been telling them Jesus does not give you a get out of Torah free card. You have to follow Torah law. If you want to join our groups, our Jewish groups, you have to follow Torah law. And that means snip, snip, buddy. You gotta, I know it's gonna hurt, but you gotta get it cut off. It's time for your circumcision. And all these groups are like, no, keep that away from me. I am absolutely not getting anything cut off. I like my privates just the way they are. This is a deal breaker. And Paul's been insisting, as we talked about last week, he's been insisting, no, I'm sorry, this is the rule. You follow the Torah law or you're not part of the community. But he has this epiphany, as Burton Mack explains. And in his epiphany, first, there's two steps to get from where Paul was, where he's trying to shepherd or herd these Judeophile symposia into righteousness, into following Torah law. There's two epiphanies that he has that get him from that to where he begins his ministry. And the first epiphany, as Burton Mack says, is the hardest, which is, what if these Galilean groups are right and Paul is wrong? What if they really don't have to follow Torah law? And as Burton Mack says, for somebody who prided himself on his righteousness under the law, this has got to be the toughest possible pill to swallow. I mean, Burton Mack quotes Philippians, where Paul says, I quoted this last week, but a lot of us weren't there then, that Paul says he was circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church, the early Christian church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. This is Philippians 3, 5-6. So his whole identity is as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisee, a righteous Jew who is chasing around all these little Judeophile symposia that keep cropping up all over Galilee and telling him to knock it off. If you want to be a Jew, you gotta be a Jew. Now, the problem that Paul is having is that to be a Jew isn't just about following Torah law. You also have to ethnically be a Jew, and not a single one of these Gentiles is. So, in making the arguments that they can be allowed in, but only if they follow Torah law, he's already compromising Judaism as he understands it. And he has been for years. You see the problem? He's like, if there are two requirements, and one requirement is that you ethnically be a Jew, and the other requirement is that you follow Torah law, and those are both the requirements to be a Jew. And he's been running around these early Christian communities telling them they're doing it wrong. They can only join if they follow Torah law. Then he himself is breaking the rules. This is before he's a Christian. He's breaking the rules because he's setting aside ethnicity. He's saying, we are willing to set aside ethnicity if you will follow the law. So that's already bugging him. It's been bothering him for a while. And so he, at least from time to time, is going to speculate about, well, what if the Galileans, if I'm willing to concede on the first point, that you don't have to ethnically be a Jew to join into these holy communities, then what if I'm wrong about the second point? What if you don't actually have to follow Torah law? What if the Christians are right? And he's just sitting there going, I don't see how I could possibly accept this. This is just awful. I mean, who are we without the Torah? But the Galileans are arguing, no, you don't understand. This is a chance for for the blessed community of the Jews to incorporate the whole world in a great brotherhood of man. The light to civilization that Judaism is supposed to be, it will only be able to fulfill its promise if it finds a way to let in all these people who lack the ethnicity and don't want to remove parts of themselves, in order to, to follow Judaism. But now he's got the thought, okay, it's a terrible idea that I'm wrong about this and that they're right. But if they are right, it would explain so much. It would explain why is it that we were ruled by our own people just 60 years ago, and God saw fit to have us be conquered by the Romans? Why? How is this God's plan? And why, partly as a result of that, but partly for other reasons, why are so many of us scattered so far from the temple? Because he's living during Second Temple Judaism. And so the whole cycle of rites and rituals surrounding the temple is part of the daily life of most Jews, except you have all these Jews scattered too far away from the temple to participate. Whether they're in Ethiopia, because there's a lot of Jews in Ethiopia at this time, or whether they're in Syria or Thessaly, which we're coming to today. It doesn't make sense. Why would it be God's plan to scatter these people so far away from the temple that they can't be part of it? And so it occurs to him, if each of these scattered synagogues could become a seedbed, if the Galileans are right, if the early Jesus movement is right, and these guys could become a seedbed, these synagogues could become a seedbed to draw in all kinds of people from all around the world into as close to righteousness as they're capable of getting, despite the lack of ethnicity, and maybe even despite not following all of Torah law. But if they get the heart of it, to work together, to form a community, to take care of each other, to be kind and good to one another, to cherish wisdom, to value these things above, obeying imperial law and so forth. Well, then they start thinking, Paul starts thinking, this could be God's plan. This might be the plan all along. It makes sense out of everything that has happened in recent Jewish history, he's thinking to himself. And as Burton Mack says, and this is something I apologize for last week. So Sharon and the others who weren't here last week, now you get my apology too. I've been saying for ages that Paul had this epiphany. He had a vision. He was struck by a vision. He literally saw Jesus, because that's the story from Acts, isn't it? The light on the road in Damascus and all that. But if we accept as the scholar's position that Acts is beautiful fiction, if it's mythology, then, and we look at Paul to say, well, what does Paul have to say about his conversion? He actually doesn't use the word that means I was having visions. He says, I had a revelation. And a revelation doesn't have to be a vision. It can be an epiphany. It can be an aha experience. And the way that this passage in Galatians 1:15-16 is typically translated, such as in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible that so many people read, it's translated as God was pleased to reveal his son to me. And that sounds like a vision, doesn't it? Right? He revealed, the curtain parted and I saw God's son. And I said, oh no, why have I persecuted him? I mean, it fits with Acts if we translate it that way. But Burton Mack says, no serious translator of the Bible thinks you can translate it that way, because the Greek word is not the preposition to. It's en, which means in or by means of, but it never means to. So actually what this passage should read is that God was pleased to make his son known by means of me. His calling. It's his calling. The epiphany is he realizes that if he stops telling all these guys they're doing it wrong, and if he starts saying, well, what if they're doing it right? And my job is to go spread the word and get as many people as possible to join this new hybrid Jewish Gentile holy community. If it's not a vision, if it's a discovery, a realization that comes from years and years of interaction, it would explain a few things. You'd see why he would feel like This is going awfully far from what I was raised to do. He wants to go check in with the Jerusalem pillars and see what they think. And what they think is, what are you, according to Paul, their reaction is, what the heck are you talking about? I mean, we're not going to bless what you're doing. I mean, we won't curse what you're doing, but we don't want any part of what you're doing. Because the Jerusalem pillars are the most Jewish that we know about of the branches of early Christianity. They're absolutely concerned with Torah law, and they're concerned with ethnicity. Both of the things, right? They're a Christianity for ethnic Jews who want to continue to follow Torah law. And not only what Paul is recommending now, but what Paul was doing before his conversion are both anathema to them. They're like, no, we don't care. We are not reaching out to the Gentiles and inviting them in, no matter what they do, whether they follow Torah law or not. No. And so they basically agree, according to Paul, they basically agree to do a division of labor, which is, okay, since you don't care about the Gentiles at all, then you don't care if I form little communities of Gentiles that are all trying to follow, trying to build communities and be kind to each other. And James and Peter and John are like, yeah, sure, whatever, just go away. This is what comes through in the letter, right? So that's 48. We've talked about 50 is when he wrote First Thessalonians. We've talked about 48, which is when he travels to meet the Jerusalem pillars. But here's the other thing that Paul says that's really quite striking. He says it was 14 years since he had his epiphany before he met with the Jerusalem pillars. 14 years. Do a little math. That means 34. Paul has his epiphany. 34. That is, I mean, according to the standard dating of Jesus's life, that is like right after he died, like a year later, which is confusing. It's confusing because Paul says he's been chasing around these Jesus movement Galilean communities for years. This is something he's been up to for a long time. And it only gradually dawned on him that what if those guys are right? Right? So what has it been 5 years, 10 years that he's been chasing around these Gentile communities and telling them they're doing it wrong and trying to get them to follow Torah law? And these communities have to post date Jesus's death, right? They have to, because they wouldn't have all these arguments with each other. They wouldn't all disagree with each other if they could just turn to Jesus and say, well, what should we do? This is a bunch of separate communities sort of figuring out. These are early Christian communities, or at least what Burton Mack says is we might not recognize them as Christians according to theology today, but you could call them early Jesus movement gatherings. They're symposia of Jews and Gentiles coming together and debating what kind of better world they want to create together and sharing meals and so forth. So that's evidently been going on for years before 34, which suggests, according to Paul's own documented evidence in his letters, that our dates are wrong for Jesus. Right? 0 or 1 AD or 1 BC, wherever you want to put it, it's got to be wrong. He's got to be he must have died at least 10 years before Paul has his epiphany. Our timeline is off. This becomes pretty, I mean, this is just straightforward from reading Paul's letters. It's just it's what's possible. So I emphasize this in order to just sort of to reiterate the idea that as we're studying early Christianity, part of what we're trying to study is, as with the Greeks, we have to distinguish between the actual history, as best we can reconstruct it from the fragmentary evidence, and the mythological history, because they both matter. The actual history matters to understanding what actually took place, but the mythological history is important for understanding the beliefs that motivate people for thousands of years after this, that there's a separation between the two. And that same separation existed among the Greeks. I mean, all these different tribes were constantly saying, well, my founder is Hercules. Well, my founder is Theseus. Well, my founder is Oedipus. There's no evidence that's true in any case. But, if you were going to be the king of Thebes, of course you wanted to, get the noble founding houses, somewhere into your genealogy. Of course, the Athenians are trying to chase everything back to Theseus or Erechtheion or whoever, their founding people are. So the mythological history matters, but the actual history matters. And Paul is grounding us in some actual history. It's very valuable. All right, so far so good. Let's take a look at Thessalonians. So we know that he went to meet in Jerusalem. We know that he also went to meet in, was it Antioch? I think it was Antioch, sometime around then. So maybe that's somewhere between 47 or 48 or 49. Paul's in Antioch. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that dating of 34 is the earliest possible date. They do point out they're not actually sure of the exact date that he's counting down the 14 years from. Yeah, it could have been 50 AD that he's counting down the years from. Why I like the traditional dating is that this is a claim of Luke. So either Luke's completely wrong, we don't know. Bart Ehrman likes an earlier dating. But Luke's claim is John the Baptist began his ministry in the, what was it, the 15th year of Tiberius. This is either it's completely wrong, but this is a very definite dating. Now, the other tradition is there was a 6 months age difference between Jesus and John. The point they make is that you weren't allowed to independently preach until you reach the age of 30, which for them meant turning 29 because you're in your 30th year. So the claim is that John the Baptist and Jesus had their 29th birthday by our standards in the year 29, when Tiberius's reign had reached its 15th year, which is 14 years and so much in our terms. The other thing is the Roman financial crisis has possibly been something that triggered the spread of Christianity, which is something which culminated. It went from the overthrow of Sejanus. It's always good to see Patrick Stewart get killed in what was it? I Claudius. Yeah, he had hair in I Claudius, which is quite amusing. And Sejanus was overthrown in 31 AD. And then when Tiberius took control again, he was a miser. He liked to fill up the treasury. And this caused, influenced a little bit of a monetary problem. Personally, I think Tiberius was right. I like a tight fiscal policy, but so this serious situation was arising, and due to other events, that there was like a depression or a recession. I claim that if there was a depression in Judea, nobody's harvesting the olives because they got nobody to sell them to. You got all these poor people standing around with nothing to do and no income. Great time for a big audience. And out of 100 poor and silly people, you're going to find one guy who's an Elon Musk, who's going to go somewhere and they're going to remember your name. So yeah, there's that huge debate. What is the dating? Well, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And part of what this underscores is when we're talking about mythological history, the dates can be whatever works. We can just try to knit our sources together and make them all make sense. But when we're talking about actual history, we have to look at what evidence do we have, And if the evidence is contradictory, like, Stephen is describing, we've got multiple possibilities for the dates, then we basically have to agree that we don't know. It's somewhere in here ish. Um, we want to be able to distinguish between the things that we're forced by the evidence to take a stand on versus the things that we are able to suspend judgment and say, if we don't take a stand, if we say it's somewhere in here as far as we can tell, then if next week at Oxyrhynchus they dig up a whole tome buried in that giant junk pile they've been excavating for decades and will probably be excavating for decades more, and it actually has a chronology through this period that gives us all the details, then none of us will be wrong. We can all say, yeah, we knew, we weren't sure, and now we have this evidence that pins it down for us. But at the moment we don't. We just have various suggestive bits that don't entirely agree with each other. It's somewhere in here.
So which one is important? This is, I'm just going to go on a little bit of a tangent there. But are you a Gnostic or are you the other kinds? Because the Gnostics believe that you have to know to reach salvation, whereas Jesus doesn't say that.
Right.
He says, be alert.
Yes.
For the bridegroom to come along.
Yes.
Don't be caught napping.
Yes.
Be caught involved in other things. It's time to put everything down and await the coming. And this is not saying, well, yeah, I know knowledge is useful and we do need a certain amount of knowledge, but this isn't about knowing a method, knowing something really so much that this is going to save you. Keep your eyes open, practice vigilance and alertness.
Yes.
Rather than spend your time trying to come up with, a perfect rational delineation of what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Because as Schelling warned in his last lectures, when everybody expected him to give a perfectly rational delineation of the world, he claims that that's impossible. You're always going to be missing a little bit as regards existence.
Yes.
We create a rational description of an essence, but that will always be missing a little bit of what existence is always going to precede the essence.
That's right.
Okay.
Very existentialist of you, Stephen. Right there with you. Yeah, this is, if we found our epistemology on Murphy's Law with the recognition that to err is human, then we learn not to die on a hill that we actually can't defend. We learn to do what Stephen's saying, to be observant and vigilant for information and guidance, but to not convince ourselves that we already have all the answers. Because if we convince ourselves we already have all the answers, it makes us complacent. Right? We feel that it is familiar to us. And what does Hegel warn us? He says what is familiar to us is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. Familiarity is a kind of blindness. If I become too familiar, if I decide that Geneva is just the person that I've always known, it blinds me to the wonder and mystery of Geneva. And when I first meet Geneva, I know she's a wonder and a mystery because I don't know anything about her. She's just this great constellation of questions. But if I talk myself into thinking oh, that's just Geneva, I know who that is, then of course she's still full of wonders and mysteries and questions. But now I've cut myself off from them and I've put myself to sleep. I'm to use the word that Aeschylus uses in the Agamemnon, I am aphylactos. I'm not on guard for the new information. I'm not watching because I'm taking her for granted, which I shouldn't do. So I'm with Stephen on this. I think it's important to acknowledge the things that we don't know, but that we are still keenly interested in. And if new information comes along, we want it. we're watching for it. We want to see it. So, all right. So what else can we say about this? We could say if 48 is perhaps, according to Paul, when Paul was in Jerusalem meeting with the pillars, and somewhere around there, he went to Antioch, and apparently the Antioch meeting didn't go all that well either. Paul then says, once those were passed, he then began his ministry, and we know he came from Syria, actually, and I got to say that, don't I, in the chat? Syria. He starts in Syria. He's a Syrian Jew. That's where his life begins, and so after 48, he then goes to Philippi, then Thessalonica, then Athens, and then he sends Timothy back to Thessalonica. And Timothy comes back to Athens and says, "Hey, it's going great. Got a couple of questions, but otherwise, the community that you set up in Thessalonica, we're clear from Thessalonians that Paul set up that church in Thessalonica. So he's starting churches. He's taking what inspired him possibly in 34, possibly at some other time about the existing Galilean, synagogue symposia Jesus movement, and he's now trying to replicate it on a grand scale to help make Judaism the light to the world that he believes it was meant to be through using Jesus as his gateway to let the Gentiles in. And so he starts in Philippi, then he goes to Thessalonica, then he goes to Athens. He sends Timothy back. Timothy returns to Athens and says it's going great. They have a couple of questions, and Paul sits down to write a letter, and this is pretty much dated to 50. This is First Thessalonians. And so it tells us some things about his life, not things that we got from Acts, from Luke inventing his mythological history of Christianity. This is Paul's own autobiography of where he's been and what he's been doing. He's been setting up churches, and now he's writing to them. We don't know if he'd previously written to other churches. We don't know. We don't. We have no reason to believe we have all of Paul's letters. We have no reason to believe we even have most of Paul's letters. We just have some of his letters. As with everything else about early Christianity, as with anyone who's interested in Heraclitus, we have fragments. And from those fragments, we try to make the most that we can to make sense out of what's happening. So, yeah. All right. So, what does he have to say in Thessalonians? Well, a couple of things. First of all, everything about First Thessalonians reinforces the things that Sharon's been saying for years about Paul. This is a man for whom the theology is important as a way to create the community. The creation of the community is the point. Setting up these churches is the point, and having them understand that they are forming a new brotherhood of man, a new cosmopolitan, non-tribal kind of gathering in which they respect one another, they care for one another, nobody's above anybody else, and they, in doing this, are joining a larger movement of other churches in other places that they can be related to. And that this is, as Stephen has said, an apocalyptic movement. The purpose of this is to incrementally replace the current world order with a new world order. And we're going to do it one group at a time. And it could happen fast. No one knows how quickly this will spread. Paul's doing his bit to spread it, to accelerate it. But no one knows at what point do they reach the tipping point, and now suddenly the old order is gone. I suspect none of them really knew it was going to take centuries. But some of them at least would not have been daunted by that. Oh yeah, Aristotle's book De Anima. Yes. So much to say about that one. All right, so it means that, part of what's astonishing about Thessalonians is that it says that his mission Thessalonica is named after Thessaly. It's in Macedonia, north of Greece, and they were, as far as we know, they had no Jesus movement at all there. The Jesus movement was originally centered in Galilee, and it had been spreading, but it hadn't got that far yet. The Macedonians, they're seriously Hellenistic. I mean, right? Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great both came from there to conquer Greece and then conquer the known world, if you will. This is a very non-Judaized, very Hellenized, very Gentile part of the world. And you would not, if you were just thinking in abstracto, you would not have guessed that this movement would be particularly attractive to people who have been Hellenes for a long time. I mean, as Bert and Mac talked about how disrupted people were in Galilee and Syria and Babylon and so forth. Not so much in Macedonia. I mean, Macedonia has been Macedonia for centuries. And yet, evidently, his mission was highly successful. They formed a church, and when he sent Timothy back there later to go see how it was doing great. It didn't die out when he left. It didn't, unlike some of his other letters, this isn't a letter full of frustrations about how much they've deviated because other people have led them astray. They're still pretty much on the straight and narrow. They just have some questions. They have some questions. So, something about Paul's message, his charisma, and his model for the new community is really attractive, even to people you would have thought it wouldn't be particularly attractive to. You'd have thought he'd be spreading like wild in Galilee and Syria and places like that, but no, here he is all the way back on the mainland of Europe. But now what? They have a couple of questions. So the first thing he wants to do is he wants to write to them and say, "Hey, good. I'm just so pleased to hear that you guys are doing great." So they have two questions, and one of them is about what is the proper conduct for Christians. That's 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 through 12. And the other question they have is about those who died. So he offers four basic parts as responses in his letter. And the first thing he says is he commends them for their reception of the gospel. He says, "You guys are doing great. You're a model. I wish every church was like you. You should continue on as you have begun." He then distinguishes his own activity from the more familiar itinerant philosophers who sell their wisdom by flattery and rhetorical trickery. That's in 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3:13. He's like, remember, we've talked about before that this is an era in which there are traveling preachers all over the Greco-Roman world. There are mendicant tricksters and troublemakers and preachers. Like Stephen said in Monty Python and the Life of Brian, there's a scene where Brian's walking through the marketplace and he passes a row of different preachers, each on their own platform, each shouting something completely different from the guy before him, each with a completely different, mood. One guy is just this raging oratory of, the end times are coming and you're all going to die. And one guy is this very humble, really anti-charismatic, quiet little prophet who's making these strange prophecies that sound like they don't matter. A friend will lose a friend's hammer, and somebody will stub their toe, and of course, what's hilarious to those who watch the movie is every single thing the boring prophet says comes to pass in the movie, and turns out to be important. That the boring thing that he describes comes to pass at an incredibly important moment and has a giant outcome. But nobody can tell that. Brian can't tell that. He's just like, okay, whatever. And I forget who else he sees. But since the Romans are pursuing him and he's about to get caught, he shoves one guy off of a box and he stands up and pretends to be a preacher. And next thing he knows, he's got a whole following. So Paul is, we all think, well, that's just satire. But it's actually surprisingly good history. That's going on all over the Greco-Roman world. There are people in the agoras and marketplaces, and they're preaching about everything under the sun. They're preaching Judaism. They're in Macedonia, none of them are preaching the new Jesus movement, but they would be preaching, to follow Isis or to follow Dionysus or to follow, Hippocrates is another popular one. All of this is going on, and he's saying, I'm not like any of those guys, right? I'm just trying to pass on the message that I was given as authentically as possible because I know this is the way forward for the brotherhood of man, and I'm just so delighted that you're doing it. He then, when it comes to the behavior, the proper conduct, how are you supposed to act? His third part of his message is he exhorts the congregation to aspire to a life of blamelessness and holiness. This is 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 through 12, and 5, 12 through 22. And in this, we see that this goes really well with the stuff we talked about earlier. We see how Paul is saying, okay, I can't make you ethnic Jews, so that's out. And I can't make you follow all of Torah law. But the bulk of Torah law, anything in Torah law that is about being good to one another and good to the world and faithful to God, that I'm really going to insist on. It's like this is the kernel for him, for Paul, the kernel of Judaism is this wisdom teaching about how to be decent human beings and form decent communities. And just because he's letting go of certain specific rites and rituals like circumcision doesn't mean he's letting go of all of Torah law. He's trying to keep all of the really humane stuff intact. Because, and I'm going to call on Sharon in a second, but I mean, I'm anticipating Sharon that she would say Paul does this because Paul recognizes that's how you make a community. This is the part that the Jews are getting the most right from the perspective of outsiders is, my God, they have communities and they don't turn on each other. They take care of each other. That's what we need for everybody. Everybody should behave like this. And this is what Paul is pushing in the third part of his argument. And now I'm going to call on Sharon. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I just wanted to say that, Paul had 3 missionary journeys, and I think Thessalonica is on the 2nd journey. But more importantly, there's a very good movie on Netflix about Paul, right? And it's showing now, so we could watch it. And it's about his 2nd and 3rd journeys. That's it.
You just dropped that teaser on us and you're not going to give us the name?
The movie is called Paul.
Oh, Paul. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
And it's showing on Netflix.
Okay. Okay. Netflix film Paul. I will watch that before next week. I will so that I can bring it to that. My expectation is that an enormous amount of that film will be based on Acts and not based on Paul's epistles.
Correct.
Yes.
A significant amount of that film is based on Acts and his interaction with Luke.
Yes. Yes.
And not too much Silas and Timothy.
Right. Right. But I still want to watch it because I have to learn both, as part of the studies for this, I need to learn both histories, the mythological Luke history and the literal Paul history. So thank you for pointing me to that resource. I will watch that before next week. So we can chat about it. The 4th part of Thessalonians, and Stephen, now is when we get to make you happy. The 4th part of Thessalonians, he offers an apocalyptic instruction about the day of the Lord. This is 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 5:11. And so the exhortation to a life of holiness is Paul's answer to the question about proper conduct, which the Thessalonians asked Timothy about while he was there. But the other question they asked about how to take care of the dead, his response is the apocalyptic instruction. That's his answer to the question about how should we treat the dead. Now, this chapter about Thessalonians in Burton Max, who wrote the New Testament, is particularly interesting with what he says next. He says the thing to understand is that when we talk about all of these people from across what became the Alexandrian Empire and then the Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and finally the Roman Empire. When we talk about all these people who are dislocated, their temple states smashed, and in many cases them being physically picked up and relocated, like when the Jews were stolen away to Babylon for years, and then it was a long time before they could come back home. That sort of thing isn't only happening to the Jews, it's happening to everybody. People are being dislocated and moved from place to place. And even the ones who aren't dislocated, because their temple state system is smashed, it is as though they are dislocated in place. The rug is pulled out from under them. And one of the most fundamental parts of any culture is about what your relationship is supposed to be to your dead. In Gilbert Murray, in 5 Stages of Greek Religion, talks about this as one of the earliest stages of Greek religion. 5 stages. Let me put it in the chat. This is a book that Kenneth Smith really appreciates. He says, if you want to conquer a people, you can't just beat them militarily. And you can't just dominate them and tell them to do all the things you do, because they'll fight you until they're all dead, or you're dead, or both. The people have very strong feelings about their relationships to their ancestors, especially the dead, especially the proximate dead, but even going back further, that there's a feeling of rootedness in the soil where your own dead have been buried. Chief Seattle's famous speech, for example, talks about, why the land is holy to the Salish is because their dead are everywhere here. This is the land that their ancestors are literally making up and composing. They're creating this land. The soil of this land is the flesh and blood of their own distant ancestors, and they love it and they're attached to it, and they're not going to, they would fight to the death rather than be dislocated from it. It's holy, it's sacred. And Gilbert Murray says this was a problem to the Hellenes when they conquered the Greek peninsula. So they conquer all of these indigenous peoples there, but then somehow they're going to have to make their peace with the fact that those people still need to and want to carry out their rites and rituals for the dead. And if they let them do that, and if they can find some way to harmonize with it, then the Greek conquerors and the indigenous conquered peoples can become one new people together. But if they fight them on it, they'll never be at peace. And Paul recognizes he's got a problem here. And the problem that he has is he's telling these people to dislocate themselves from this corrupt Roman Empire and join and help create this new community, a new people. We're going to be a new people together. But the question is, what about my parents who didn't convert? What about my grandparents who are buried in the soil out back? What is, as a new Christian, what is my relationship to all these family ties that are the foundations of everything? Are you asking us to sever those ties and to be dislocated from our own past and our own families? What exactly are you talking about here? And Paul's got to come up with a good answer. And, Burton Mack's line, he says that the typical interpretation is that this isn't something that Paul was taught. The answer to this question is not part of what Paul received from the people before him, with whom he converted to Christianity. This is a lacuna. This is a gap. It wasn't there. And that's a big fat problem because he needs an answer right now. Because the Thessalonians are, on the one hand, a model church that he wants all the others to be like. But on the other hand, it could all fall to pieces if he can't come up with something that's going to put them at peace with their metamorphosis from, Gentiles in the old sense to Christians in the new sense. And although there may have been, and probably were, apocalyptic strands of Christianity, because we talked about there being 2 or 3 different strands in early Christianity, the one that Paul learned from was not an apocalyptic strand. And he shared with us, he quoted for us. I mean, I just put them in the chat at the beginning of this call. He quoted for us the actual passages, which are what he learned. That is the core of the teaching. And in the core of that teaching, there's no apocalypse. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't other apocalyptic Christians just the very next village over. This is what I mean about how different these different strands are from each other. And the apocalyptic version of Christianity that might have been in the next village over could have been older, an older form of Christianity than the one that Paul learned. These guys don't know each other. They aren't talking to each other. Mostly they haven't heard of each other, which is why it's so remarkable when Paul tells us he actually heard of and met with the pillars in Jerusalem. Mostly these guys don't know about each other, but Paul did know about that group. And as we'll see in some of his other letters, he occasionally mentions another group. But his group wasn't apocalyptic until now, because now he has to answer this question. Those who have died, and what Paul says is that, and he says this in 1 Thessalonians 4:14 through 15, he says God would bring with him those who have died at the coming of the Lord. The coming of the Lord. This is Paul's conception of the apocalypse that he's putting together and erecting atop the foundation of what he was taught. The non-apocalyptic thread of Christianity that he was taught, he's in the process in 1 Thessalonians of converting it into an apocalyptic Christianity as a way to solve this problem of what his new church is supposed to do with their own dead. He says, that discussion, when we read First Thessalonians and the passage about God bringing with him those who died at the coming of the Lord, we read it as a Rorschach test. We read it through the lens of the Gospels and Acts and the Apocalypse of John. We read it through the lens of 1,000 years of medieval Christianity. We read it through the lens of 500 years of Reformation Christianity and Counter-Reformation Catholicism and all the other varieties that are around. And this is one of the places where it is the most hard for us to read what Paul actually wrote, the way that Paul wrote it. It's just so tempting to put into it what isn't there. Because again, I know this one. We know the rest of we want to fill in the puzzle with all the pieces that we've learned. But those pieces aren't missing in Paul's letter. They just aren't there. They aren't needed. Paul's letter is complete. It's not missing anything. It has its own picture of what an apocalypse means and of what this means to the people who are worried about the dead. So we always, when we read this, we take it as an indication that the Thessalonians were worried about personal salvation. And we take it as that they were worried about fellow Christians who died since Paul visited. And what's going to happen to them? Do they get to go to heaven? And this is almost always how Sunday school teaches this. It's how most preachers today teach this passage. But there's actually no indication in the letter that that's what Paul means. He doesn't talk about any of those things. That's just us reading in what we expect to find there. And again, the canonizers of the 4th century, so clever, moving the epistles after the Gospels, so it's so hard for us to read what he wrote. It's hard for us to hear what he's telling us. Instead, we hear what the Gospels tell us and read it into Paul. So, that would, if it were true that the Thessalonians were worried about the personal salvation of their fellow Christians who died since Paul was among them and who would not be alive when the Lord returned, that would mean that the Thessalonian church he had set up was a church of apocalyptic Christians. But that's not actually what Paul says. That's us reading into it. There are other apocalyptic Christian churches that have nothing to do with Paul that are going on side by side, but his church wasn't apocalyptic until now, because he comes up with the apocalypse as his solution to the problem. He says, the Christ myth, the kerygma that we quoted up above, where is it? There it is, in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. It doesn't include an apocalypse. Paul is going to convert his thread of Christianity from a non-apocalyptic church to an apocalyptic church. And he's going to start doing it right now in 1 Thessalonians. There are other apocalyptic churches elsewhere. They were already there, but not Paul's. Paul's is now doing it for the first time. And it's interesting to see what he's doing and why he's doing it. So it's basically, when he reminds them that they turned to God from idols, that they serve a living and true God, and that they're waiting for his Son from heaven, whom God raised from the dead, Jesus who rescues us from the wrath that is coming. In Thessalonians, this is, as Burton Mack says, the thing about the way that this is expressed is that it makes more sense as something that he's coming up with now than it does as something that he had taught them to begin with. Because remember, the people that he converted weren't Jews. They didn't have an apocalyptic perspective. They were Greeks. I mean, the Macedonians had a Greek perspective. Apocalypse were not part of their worldview. And that's why it wouldn't have made sense for Paul to approach them. I mean, it would be different if they were the Norse, right? If it was Paul's mission to the Norse, they're totally ready for Ragnarok. They've got Ragnarok already. They're ready for an apocalypse. You can preach a Christian apocalypse to a people that already believes in Ragnarok. But to the Macedonians, you never could have brought them over by saying, the reason that you should, follow my version of God is because my God's going to punish everybody unless you do. Everyone's like, screw you, buddy. I've got a choice of dozens of gods. Why do I want to pick the angry God? Especially when they have been raised since birth not to expect anything like an apocalypse. So for these reasons, Burton Mack argues, it's pretty clear that when Paul first sets up the Thessalonican church, it is not It is not an apocalyptic church. And it is First Thessalonians where he's introducing the apocalypse in order to solve the problem. And as we see from the way that he's worded it, solving the problem, his letter actually will solve the problem for them. And it's the apocalypse plays a critical role in making this happen. So Paul suggests that the way that he's written suggests that he's not really talking about personal salvation for either the living or the dead. That the question is one of belonging. Are you, if you're being incorporated into the family of God, how do you imagine the place and destiny of the dead in relation to the kingdom of God now that their own people, the Thessalonians, have become a new people? Then what is your relationship to the dead? And Paul says the Thessalonians don't have to worry. He says, God will bring those who died with him on the day of the Lord. So all will be with the Lord forever. So that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live with him. That's 1 Thessalonians 4:14 through 17, 5:10. In other words, they've joined a new family, right? The new family, the brotherhood of man, the new kingdom of God. You're in this together, and God's not going to leave you behind. He's going to bring you with him when he comes. And he's going to bring your beloved dead with you. That you should expect that there is going to come a time when Jesus comes for us all, and your beloved will not be left behind. Everyone who is with Jesus is going to be able to come and be part of it. So it's interesting because this particular discussion in Thessalonians, this apocalyptic scenario, is very different from the apocalyptic visions that are being described in other Christian groups at the time. And it's different from Jewish apocalyptic sects and how they describe the apocalypse. It's also a little different from how Paul ends up talking about departing and being with Christ in Philippians. It's different from imagining the end of history when all Israel will be saved in Romans. In 1 Thessalonians, the Lord himself comes as a thief in the night, there's there will be the archangel's wake up call with the sound of God's trumpet, and a rising from the earth of both the dead and the living to meet the Lord in the clouds and be with him forever. I mean, there's this whole vision with all these visuals and all these events that are going to happen that are really distinctive to First Thessalonians. Really unlike anything that anybody else was talking about at the time. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just want to briefly say, to the best of my recollection, in Second Thessalonians, Paul tried to dispel that apocalyptic approach to the new Christianity, because what had happened is in Second Thessalonians, the people had stopped trying to establish the church. And there was even more infighting, and it led to a lot of discord because they were sitting around waiting for God to come. And that was a problem. And so that's why Paul was so strong in Second Thessalonians about the mission instead of the apocalypse.
Yes. Yes.
That's what I remember.
There's a problem that's going to happen later in this century, because when you read what Paul says in First Thessalonians, the thief in the night, the proximate, how soon is it going to come? It has this strong sense of a parousia. That Jesus is going to come any minute now. It's going to happen. And this goes with what Stephen was saying, that there is this apocalyptic urgency in First Thessalonians. It could be tomorrow. You don't know. You really need to, not put your priorities in the wrong place, because it could be any moment now.
Well, that led to significant discord instead of enhanced adoption of the religion. There was a lot of infighting from that waiting.
Yes. If Jesus had come the next day, it would have worked out beautifully. But if you say he's going to be here any minute, and then he doesn't show, you've got a problem. And as we're going to see by the 70s and 80s, other Christian writers are saying we have a problem. because we were saying for a couple decades Jesus is going to be here during the lifetime of the people that Paul preached to, and yet they're all dying now of old age and still know Jesus. So now what are we going to do? And this is why one of the many reasons why people are pretty clear that Paul didn't write Second Thessalonians is Second Thessalonians represents that later stage of Christianity, later in the first century, when it could be somebody writing from the Pauline church that Paul established. It could be a successor to Paul easily. But now they're having to deal with a circumstance Paul didn't have to deal with, which is we thought he was coming tomorrow, and instead it's been 30 years and he hasn't come yet. And you can't build a church on something happening right away if it doesn't happen right away. You need a new foundation for your church. And that's what as you point out, that's what Second Thessalonians is trying to do. The post-Pauline community is trying to refound the church on a firmer basis that doesn't depend upon the parousia being, immediately. A church that can last through the decades. At that point, they're thinking, because they don't know how long it'll be. They're still not thinking it's going to be 2,000 years, right? I mean, it's pretty clear in the first century, nobody thought it was going to be 2,000 years and counting. But they did recognize they couldn't keep saying it's going to be tomorrow, that couldn't be the basis. And the other thing that you said is right, that what Paul has come up with in First Thessalonians, it meets the Thessalonians' needs today. It reassures them, and it gives them a sense of community and continuity, that their dead will be taken care of, and that when they die, that they'll be taken care of. And they need that to help go forward year by year. But that solution is the exact same thing that becomes the problem 10 years later, 15, 20 years later. It's funny how this works, right? And so this is one of the ways in which you can sort of see in Paul the process of innovation, of mythography. He's not lying. He doesn't feel that he's inventing. What he's doing is he's trying to be as absolutely true as he can to the foundation he was given, but that foundation doesn't answer certain questions that now have to be answered for him to be able to build his community and build his churches. And so he has to come up with answers that are consistent with, that don't contradict what he was taught. And so he's extending Christianity. He's extending it within the frame as he understands it of what he was taught. But he's growing the frame. He's without violating the frame, he's showing how there's more room for thinking about death and the future and what's to come. And the fact that the solution he comes up with only works for a few decades really shows the extent to which he's having to. This is one of Burton Mack's points. He says most Bible translators and scholars get this. Paul's having to think on his feet. So on the one hand, he's delighted with Timothy's news, right? The church is thriving. They're behaving well. They're treating each other the way we want Christians to treat each other. This is the hope that he always had. But on the other hand, boy, that question is a real poser. Because as a Hellenized Jew, he knows exactly how important the dead are to people. Not only your past dead, but what happens when you die. And he realizes he's got a problem. And the Thessalonians don't know that Paul has that problem. They ask this question in all innocence, assuming that he's going to have a ready answer, but he really doesn't. And he's got to struggle to figure out what would be a version of what happens to the dead and to you when you die that in no way contradicts and that is true to the spirit of what he was taught. And so he's got to mythography. He's got to come up with something. And he does it right here. And it works for a while, but because it was a spur of the moment thing, even his later letters are going to contradict this one. Because once he's had more time to think about it, he's going to come up with a better version of explaining the relationship of life to death within the framework of the Jesus movement. And so in his other letters, we're going to see more refined versions of this. This first version is bold. I mean, trumpets and people rising in the air. I mean, this is some exciting stuff that Paul is coming up with here. It's huge. Some of this he has to tone down in his later letters. But the important thing about it is not so much the literal thing that he says is going to happen, but going back to what Sharon has always said about Paul, he is using everything he has and everything he is to try to find a way forward for this new community so that they can create the brotherhood of man. He needs to find a way for them to have that confidence that they need to do the right thing. You know, the things that they worry about, some of the things that they worry about, he would think those aren't the things you ought to be worrying about. But he can't, but he's educated. He knows he can't tell people what to worry about, what not to worry about. All he can do is try to find a way forward for them. I think of it like Dumbo and the feather, right? Dumbo didn't actually need that feather. Not literally, he didn't need the feather. He could fly, he's a flying elephant. But on the other hand, he did need the feather because you do need your confidence. If you don't have the confidence to try, you'll never discover that you have the ability to do it. And so in that sense, even though he didn't need the feather, he did need the feather. It was his training wheels, his prosthesis to get off the ground until he could eventually learn to do without it. And for Paul, I have to think that this early version of the apocalypse in First Thessalonians, that's what it is, right? That's First Thessalonians. This early vision of the apocalypse is his rough draft. I hope this will give you the confidence to do the right thing, which is be together, treat one another with love, you know, bring about the new world together, one church at a time, one kind gesture at a time, and disengage from the old world, which isn't working for anybody. Start letting go of it. Arindavaya Silberman, welcome to the call. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I kind of posted a question in the chat. I wanted to know about the first version of this solution that he comes up with. Like, is it that all of the beloved dead come, with the end times? Or do they come with the divine? Is it only the beloved dead of the people that are the new Christians now? Or is it all of the dead that ever existed? And what's the logic behind that?
He's a little ambiguous, isn't he? I mean, if you read First Thessalonians, there's parts of this he answers crisply and precisely, and there's parts of it he doesn't. So the big change in First Thessalonians, he's trying to get these Hellenized people, these Greeks. He understands that the way they think about the world is that when you die, you don't go to an afterlife, right? I mean, to the Greeks, your soul is just your breath that you exhale. And yeah, your soul remembers who you were, but it can't think any new things or do any new things. It's like that kind of ghost that we see in modern ghost films that's just a movie replaying over and over something that happened. And it's why when Odysseus needs to ask questions of the dead in Hades, he has to bring down a little blood with him to feed to them, to give them a little bit of body to go with the disembodied spirit, because only a body animated by a soul is capable of being alive. A soul by itself has no life. The Greeks don't believe in an afterlife. It's something else that happens in Hades, something that's hard for us to register. And he knows the Macedonians see it that way. So for the Macedonians, whatever part of them they exhaled that's down in Hades, that's not them. Them are the bones buried in the soil with their ancestors in their sacred ground that has been their ground forever. And they think in terms of, they have always thought in terms of, when I die, I expect to go be with my ancestors in the ground. I want to be with them. It's a comfort to think that I'll be laid to rest beside, my sleeping ancestors. So they're thinking in terms of going to be with the dead bodies. They're going to be in the sacred soil, in the tombs. But what Paul is doing is turning that on its head and say, you don't have to worry about going to be with the dead, because instead you're going to come with Jesus into his kingdom. You're going to transcend the land, the place, and come be part of this new thing that Jesus is creating and that you're creating together by being part of the blessed community. So he's trying to get them to think, instead of thinking about the past and your body going to join the past when you die, he's trying to get them to think about the future and coming forward to join with, the kingdom of God as Jesus is creating it. And because that's his focus, some of the kinds of questions you're asking, he doesn't entirely pin down. To us who are not Thessalonians, who don't have the concern that the Thessalonians have, we ask questions that it wouldn't have occurred to the Thessalonians to ask, like the question you just asked. And Paul knows he doesn't have this all worked out. So he doesn't try to go into too much detail. He doesn't try to create a complete system and fill out a complete vision of the afterlife and how it's going to work. He just focuses on this sense of it's okay. You're going to be okay. You're going to come with Jesus. We're all going to come with Jesus. You'll be part of this community together. And the dead who you love, you don't have to worry about them. Maybe because they come with Jesus, maybe for some other reason. He's a little, he's a little squirrely around this part. He tap dances a little. You're right to ask. That is exactly, and that's part of the evidence that Burton Mack and other translators use to say this clearly is not part of the teachings that he received. He's having to think on his feet. He does not have it all worked out. And in later letters, he has worked more of it out. That what he says in some of the other letters about what's to come is more solid, more complete, more grounded, more systematic, and answers more of the questions that you and I would ask. But in this first one, he's just trying to figure out how to keep the Thessalonians' worries about the dead from causing them to stop being such a great model community. He's just trying to get them over the hump of the next few years. And that sense of it, really, it really comes through. So some other interesting things here. In 1 Thessalonians, there's a mention. I alluded to this earlier, but it really has to be stressed here. There's a mention in 1 Thessalonians of rescue from the wrath that is coming. This is 1 Thessalonians 1:10, and the promise that God has destined us not for wrath but for salvation. 1 Thessalonians 5:9, and this is a little strange. Let me see, where am I trying to draw this together? The rescue of some and the destruction of others was standard in a lot of Jewish apocalypses that were written at the time. The point was always a theodicy in favor of the righteous. And you got to think that Paul's mention of God's wrath had to have been derived from that, because as a Hellenized Jew, he's well acquainted with the literature of Jewish apocalyptic traditions. But it's his take here is weird, because in the Jewish apocalyptic traditions, God was always angry at somebody particular. He was never just having a bad day. It was always, these particular people suck. That king that conquered our people, he sucks. Those Romans, they suck. They always had someone in mind. But here in 1 Thessalonians, Paul doesn't say with whom God is angry. And it wouldn't really have made a lot of sense to the Thessalonians if he'd been a lot more specific about it, because that really wasn't what they were asking about. They're asking about their dead. And, are they going to lose their dead, and what's going to happen to them when they die? So the wrath is merely being raised here in sort of a novel, generic fashion as the other face of God, the one that doesn't countenance immorality and uncleanness. And this is sort of saying, not only am I happy with you for your righteous behavior, according to Timothy, since I left, it's great because now God doesn't have to be angry with you. God would be angry at people like that, and he's not angry with you. You guys are being good and righteous. Now, in the second letter to Thessalonians, this all changes, and it's again some of the wrathful God stuff is with flaming fire and mighty angels is part of how we can tell that it wasn't Paul that wrote 2 Thessalonians. But let's see, editorial activity. Here's another bit in the first letter in 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16. There's a change that's made that wasn't Paul. There's a bit here where somebody's interested in directing Paul's apocalyptic preachments against those who oppose the Christian mission, and he did so by inserting a small bit that's aimed at Jews who killed Jesus and drove us out, for which reason God's wrath has overtaken them at last. This little passage in 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16 contradicts every other thing that Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, and it contradicts every other thing Paul ever said in any of his letters. Paul's not a Jew hater. Paul's a Jew. Right? I mean, this sense that the Jews drove the Christians out, Paul doesn't believe that. Paul says, "Well, when have I been driven out? I'm right here." This is clearly not Paul's voice. It's not Paul's thinking. It's not Paul's message. And pretty much everyone agrees, other than people who don't do any biblical scholarship at all. People who do pretty much without much dissent, there's been agreement that 1 Thessalonians 2:14 through 16 was added either, maybe it has to be after the destruction of the temple in 70, because that's what the driving us out thing, and the God's wrath overtaking them at last. Both of these are oblique references to the Roman, damage that they did in Judea in 70. So it had to be written. Paul was dead by then. It had to be written by then. And they just slipped it into the letter. And, other than that, the first letter to the Thessalonians is pretty entirely Paul, and it's a pretty reliable picture of his theology. For those who wonder, who would dare to go mess with these letters? There is a hypothesis, and it's been confirmed in some instances, and from that people have generalized and thought it must have happened a lot, that later preachers with a copy of one of Paul's epistles, when they're preparing their sermon, would make notes in the margins. And the notes in the margins would sometimes be references back to, bits from the Tanakh or bits from other books of the Bible. And sometimes it would be references to contemporary concerns, like whether women should talk in church, which in Paul's day, of course, they should talk in church. But, during the real misogynist period that's going to happen in about 100 years, all the guys are concerned with the fact that women should shut up and just, mind their business and let the men run everything. And that the preachers would write little notes in the margin about, yeah, I don't really like this part of Paul. After all, what about women should shut up? Where's that part? How come Paul doesn't talk about that? They'd write it in the side. And then after they died, their manuscript, which had been cherished by the church for all these years and used in sermons, would be falling apart and would be copied by some scribe to make the next generation of the manuscript. Remember, there's no printing presses, there's no Xerox machines, there's no computers. Everything has to be copied by hand, and they're all having to gauge, when is this thing falling apart, but not so fallen apart that I can't still read it, right? So when it's starting to get old and tattered, you'd hand it over to some new scribe. You'd pay a lot of money. It was very expensive. And the scribe would copy out the whole thing. And it's pretty clear that at least some of the time when they were doing the copying, they would copy the note and insert it into the text, as though what they had was a manuscript that somebody was correcting, and not that somebody was making notes to themselves. And next thing you know, here's this non-Pauline passage stuck right in the middle of 1 Thessalonians, written by some later guy who was concerned about what happened to the temple at Jerusalem. And so this is how these interpolations typically get in there. It's not usually someone saying, I don't agree with Paul, and I'm going to, forge something and make him say something he didn't say. Mostly the people doing this, they revered people like Paul too much. But their books were personal grimoires used to help them deliver sermons and other lessons. So and paper was expensive, so of course they're going to use the margins to make notes to themselves. And of course, later scribes don't know what's original and what's not. So things found their way in, and we know this because we found examples of manuscripts that have the befores and the afters. We found the older ones that don't have any notes. We found ones that have marginal notes. We found later ones in which the marginal notes been slipped right into the flow of the text. So we know this happens. And it clearly happened right here in 1 Thessalonians. But 2 Thessalonians, none of that was Paul. It was probably a Pauline community. But it's probably a Pauline community 50 years later or thereabouts. And their theology has changed. Their concerns have changed. I mean, my God, the Romans just trashed the second temple in Jerusalem. There's all kinds of things have happened. And those are the things that the authors, the Pauline communities who are the authors of 2 Thessalonians are concerned about. And so, as Sharon points out, among the things they do there is they tamp down the emphasis on the apocalypse. And no, it's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to come like a thief in the night any moment now. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but and to go back to Stephen, but be ready, be on guard, live a righteous life, because it could happen at any time, not necessarily right away. Don't sell off all your property and give away everything you have and sit on the curb waiting for Jesus to ride by in his chariot and pick you up tomorrow. It may not happen. You gotta have a community for the long haul, for the long term. That's the transformation that's happening at the time that Second Thessalonians is being written later. All right, so I really went over on our Christian part of this. I was going to do more with Kenneth Smith. But you know, we had new people, we had new stuff we had to talk about, and 1 Thessalonians, it takes a little discussion. So you can see how this fits into the framework that Paul already gave us of what Christianity was when he received it. And this gives us a snapshot, not of what all Christianity was in 50 when he wrote this letter, not even most Christianity. This is something Burton Mack stresses for us. He says, the temptation is to assume that Paul is typical of Christians because he's our only sample. We have a sample size of 1 at this point, as far as named Christians who are living a life and telling us what's happening in that life and telling us what they believe. But Burton Mack says that's dangerous. I mean, you really can't do that. I mean, the fact that the Thessalonian church that he set up was not originally apocalyptic, for example, doesn't mean there aren't apocalyptic churches all over the place set up by other Christians. We have to dilate our minds to encompass the enormous diversity of early Christianity in the first century and acknowledge that what we're getting here is a snapshot, a moment in time of one guy in one place, an important guy, but one guy in one place writing a letter to one church and having to do some tap dancing to try to reassure them it's going to be okay. You don't have to worry about your dead. It's going to be fine. Just keep treating each other with respect and being righteous. And that's really the focus of 1 Thessalonians. Every time I read these letters, you know, next week we'll move on to his second letter, Galatians, which is juicy, full of stuff. But every time I read one of these letters, I'm reminded of what Sharon said. She's absolutely right. For Paul, the theology is entirely in service to the community. That is why, if anything, whether he talks about the apocalypse, whether he talks about, you know, what the law is that we should follow, no matter what it is, he's always writing from the perspective of how can we come together and treat each other like decent human beings? How can we make an organization that can be sustained? Well, should we do a tiny bit of Kenneth Smith before we wrap up? You know, let's at least post again in the chat where we left off. We were in. Oh, Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I just wanted to make a comment that Paul's behavior in establishing the church organization over theology is one of the interesting things about Christianity. And if you ever have a conversation with somebody who's really agnostic or even an atheist, they will tell you that you have the establishment, the foundation of the Christian church is by someone who was never ever exposed to Jesus himself. And that, in some eyes, impacts the authenticity. And I think we're seeing this as we go along here.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I went through a phase where I was just obsessed with trying to get to the real Jesus. And you know, I was using all of this literary analysis. I mean, I've got shelves of books on this subject that I've read, trying to figure out, you know, what's been interpolated, what's been forged, what's authentic, you know, what can we be sure Jesus said? And it took a while before finally I read enough people like Burton Mack who said, I mean, it's all well and good to care what Jesus said, but you really should also care what all these different Christians had to say too, because there's a lot of interesting writers in there, and they wrote things that matter. They thought long and hard about this stuff, and the things that they thought are not negligibilia to be just brushed aside in your search for Jesus. You know, you should hear from Paul. You should hear from. I got a pile of books here. The ones on the top are gardening, but you know, down here, look, I've got the Muslim Jesus. That is, what does Islam think Jesus said? You know, they have their own tradition where they preserve sayings. And who do they think he was? And then here, I have Dominic Crossan's In Fragments and in Parables, you know, which do like the Q, where they try to pick out all the little bits from the Gospels and think, well, how much of this did Jesus say? And if he said that, what does it mean? This one is The Desert Fathers, sayings of the early Christian monks. I'm really looking forward to us going through that one because that's the big wave of hermits who ran out into the desert in Egypt and elsewhere because they said this Roman Empire is too corrupt. We can't really be Christians within it. So I'm going to isolate myself from the Roman Empire. I'm going to go live in a cave in the desert. And I'm going to live simply and try to, be an ascetic and reduce my needs and spend all my time thinking about the kingdom of God and how we should treat each other and so on. And those people wrote an enormous amount of stuff that was influential for, the next 2,000 years of Christianity. They may not be Jesus, but they matter. The things they say matter.
Well, I think Christianity is probably one of the few, or probably the only religion that ascribes divinity to Jesus Christ, the Son of God.
Yes.
But the Muslims think that Jesus was simply a prophet.
Like Muhammad.
Yes, like Muhammad, and that was it. One of the things I'm interested in is how the philosophers that came on during Jesus' time and after developed the concepts like how to be, and what to believe, but how to establish your divinity.
Yes.
At this time. And this is a big growth area for me because I find it so interesting.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something, another quick reflection. I'm not sure how overly reduced it is.
No
I'm sure
baby
Stephen
yet.
might want to tell us. No baby yet. But the idea that Paul's transformation, as I'm listening to you describe it, and especially what's going to happen later, it sounds like his character arc could be generalized as going from an I to a we.
That's interesting. Look at you.
That's just a thought.
You just had this little capsule nugget to drop on us from an I to a we. Yes. Yes.
Well, it launched
Me
the
and
light
us.
bulb went off, at least for me. Like what I heard that triggered that thought was Sharon saying him being exclusively in service of the community. That is usually the signature of that kind of transformation.
You're
Yeah.
right.
Well, it could be an us. Instead of a we, it's an us.
Well, that's
Is
what
that
a we
possible?
means.
Oh,
It's just more like a linguist's term because we's acts and us are like me's, they're objects. So it's more like it's a silly thing. You're right. It's the us is exactly the same thing.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah,
No, that's all.
to get out of the individual ego into the concept of there's more than one of us here. Maybe we should do this thing together. And what's funny about that is it's Aristotelian, because it's Aristotle that says man is by nature a political animal. We need each other, right? I mean, none of us can have all the skills. There's nobody with all the gifts. We need somebody else to be the anesthesiologist and someone else to be the actress. And, so we need all these people who all learn how to do all these things. And that's the only way we get through this life is,
Well, I was also actually thinking more like almost like the Buddhist angle or the Eastern angle that he was just dissolving the self. And when there's a
yes.
death of self, that stronger thing emerges sometimes. So it's interesting. It's like getting past certain egotistical problems. And once you can bypass those, other things can emerge.
Yeah. And you could think about it as a response to the Roman Empire. It's like, okay, so everybody wants to be emperor, but maybe that's the wrong thing to want. Maybe nobody should want to be emperor. Maybe that's, that's too much me. It's not enough us. Uh, and certainly if you have a hyper egotistical era, even just trying to get back to a balanced dialectic between us and me it involves a massive move away from me because everybody's me, I all the damn time. It's like anyway, just a thought. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think that's a interesting point in the sense, even if you think in a cosmopolitan terms, it's the, you can say your ego is being dissolved, but it's also, look, Paul traveled quite a bit. And in your travels, you start to become more aware of, people's perspectives on the world. And just kind of seeing, and obviously the interactions that he had, and running into the problems that he had with even just explaining the case for Christianity, that that you start to be able I would say, look at things in a more cosmopolitan manner. So that you're actually getting outside yourself. So your ability to abstract to some degree, to imagine things, is not as limited. And so I think a lot of his experiences with that, had has an impact of it. If we're going to, maybe assume and say they're going from that I to we, that process, can be, obviously his experiences shape that. So, there's a deeper philosophical aspect to the I-we relationship. That there's this, but I think in a very practical way, when you're talking about cosmopolitan perspective, and seeing us, kind of everybody as a sister or a brother, or the God within, or having inherent worth, that is that's a result of a lot of his encounters, including his Hellenistic encounters. Very much so. I think that would definitely have shaped his perspective. That being a citizen of the world, what does that even mean? So that perspective, with his debates or conversations with Hellenistic philosophers, which are actually well thought of as a way of kind of dialogue, looking at it from a dialectical perspective. Anyway, it's interesting.
It is. Thank you, Joe. You can see how in the battle against kind of the errant egotism of the Roman Empire, if everybody wants to be emperor, but you have a community that says, well, why would I want you as my stinky emperor when I've got Jesus? He was faithful unto God. He lived a blameless, virtuous life. Can you say as much? I don't think so. You want us to depose him and put you in charge? No. It gives you this way to end every argument about people claiming, oh, you have to do what I say. I'm the boss of everybody. Like, no, that guy's the boss of everybody. You are definitely not at his level. So no, thank you. Just say no, thank you.
And there is some truth to the idea. And this is just, it sounds trite, but the idea of you die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain, that, yeah, if you're dead, that makes it even easier, right? Because this is that you forever, eternal. I'm talking about Christ here.
Right.
And
right.
so anyway, it's interesting from that perspective.
Yeah, exactly. We don't need someone to sit on the throne. The throne will be occupied for the end of eternity. We're covered. Find something else to do with your life. We don't need another emperor. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I just thought I'd add that Gentiles favorably disposed to the Hebrew God wasn't a new thing.
No.
I think, and the temple had the court of the Gentiles. So as a Gentile, you're allowed to pay your respects to the Hebrew God on a certain level. Obviously, you could donate to the good cause as well. They love that. But for the Gentile, even a pagan who comes to a country, often they want to pay respects to the local gods because they want to be on the good side of the local gods. So when we talk about Gentile followers of Jesus, this wasn't something completely new in the terms of Gentile followers of the Hebrew God. Thank you.
Well, can I just add one last thing here? Because for me, in my days of studying this, in the book of Corinth, First Corinthians, you could really see how Paul operated. So Paul, he addressed the church problems like sexual immorality, jealousy, divisiveness, and then he answered the questions in the church. He talked about singleness, Let me read it here. He talked about singleness, what kind of meat to eat, propriety in worship, right? And he talked about having property. So, and he kind of put it in a not so much of a theological background, but in faith and spirit and the spirit of Jesus Christ. But he answered the questions, right? And he tried to set the rules. And I hate that word rules, but that's what he did. And in today's churches, churches are organisms because they're made up of people. Churches look to 1st and 2nd Corinthians as they try to interpret Paul's dictum.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to when we get to Corinthians in these discussions. One step at a time, though.
I know we're in Thessalonians, but what we're talking about, I think, is exemplified more in Corinthians.
I think you're right. It really culminates there, doesn't it?
Yes.
And I guess today the final word will go to Donald. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up for the day.
I have nothing to say about the New Testament or Paul, but you talked earlier about learning to write Greek and the things. There's a guy at the British Museum, Irv Finkel, who is his specialty is cuneiform and Sumerian and Babylonian, written in cuneiform. And in excavations, they found these buildings that just had enormous piles of cuneiform tablets. And they were scribe schools. And they resurrected it, the lessons. And in fact, they used those to train modern scholars in reading cuneiform.
Using the old training.
Well, that's how they taught the original scribes.
If it worked thousands of years ago, why not now?
Yeah, he said so that technique of, if you can find where they taught the people to write in schools, you can learn that language, or at least the written form of that language. You may not know what it sounds like, but you can, you'll get the vocabulary list and the conjugation list and the declension list, and you'll think, oh, wow. So, yes, that's a well-proven method, 5,000 years old, I think.
But yeah, tried and true. Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you had a great time. This is, as Art likes to say, this is always the highlight of my week, and I love spending time with you all.
Thank you so much, Rick.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Rick. See you next week.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Rick.
Good luck.
Good luck with the baby,
Ari, with the
Gary.
baby.
Good luck with
Good
the
luck,
baby.
Good luck.
Okay.